Across the golden plains of Anatolia, an empire quietly stirred. Born from the dreams of horsemen and warriors, it grew between two seas, where the waters of the Black Sea whisper to the Mediterranean through the narrow strait of the Bosphorus. This land of rolling hills and fertile valleys, where ancient civilizations had risen and fallen for millennia, would become the cradle of one of history's most enduring powers. This was the land at the crossroads of three continents, Europe reaching its fingers toward Asia, while Africa gazed northward across sapphire waters. In this crucible of civilizations, where trade routes converged and armies had marched since time immemorial, a small Turkish tribe forged a destiny that would echo through 6 centuries. They emerged at a moment when the old order was crumbling, the Byzantine Empire weakening, the Mongol storm receding, and the medieval world giving way to something new. They rose from humble beginnings on the Byzantine frontier, eventually raising gleaming domes over conquered Constantinople. From a collection of nomadic horsemen to masters of a sophisticated state, they adapted and absorbed the knowledge of those they conquered. Their banners stretched from the rocky shores of the Black Sea to the scorching sands of Arabia, and westward to the very gates of Vienna. In their wake followed merchants and scholars, poets and architects, each adding threads to the rich tapestry of empire. The Ottomans built their power not merely through conquest, but through synthesis. They were heirs to Byzantine administration, Persian court culture, Arab religious scholarship, and the fierce martial traditions of the Central Asian steppes. In their hands, these disparate elements became something unique, neither fully Eastern nor Western, but a bridge between worlds. Their cities hummed with the languages of a dozen peoples, their markets filled with goods from Venice to Samarkand, their courts adorned with calligraphy and geometric splendor. Here, sultans ruled as both sword and shadow, where East met West not just in battle, but in the marketplace of ideas. Religions coexisted beneath the Ottoman crescent. Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived side by side in an arrangement imperfect yet remarkable for its age. Arts flourished in grand palaces where miniaturists painted with brushes of a single hair, and poets competed for the Sultan's favor. The whispers of history embedded themselves within ancient stones, in the grand mosques, bustling bazaars, and marble hammams that still stand today. Their story is one of stunning military victories and crushing defeats, of enlightened rulers and corrupt courtiers, of technological innovation and stubborn traditionalism. It is a tale of an empire that expanded rapidly in its youth, stabilized in its prime, and declined slowly in its old age, following the arc that seems common to all great powers. From the sword of Osman to the reforms of Ataturk, the Ottoman saga spans epochs and continents. This is the story of an empire that shaped our modern world, its borders, its conflicts, its cultures. An empire whose legacy lives on long after its flags have fallen. In the cuisine of the Balkans, the architecture of Istanbul, the politics of the Middle East, and the very map of our world, the Ottoman imprint remains. The story of the Ottoman Empire. The story begins in the late 13th century, when Anatolia, once the heartland of Byzantine power, had become a fractured landscape of competing principalities. The once mighty Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which had dominated the region, was crumbling under internal pressures and the devastating aftermath of Mongol invasions. The Mongol Ilkhanate now held distant suzerainty over these lands, but their control was tenuous at best. In this power vacuum, opportunity beckoned for those bold enough to seize it. Along the northwestern frontier of this disintegrating Seljuk realm, where the mountains give way to fertile plains. The borderlands between Muslim and Christian worlds were controlled by Turkish tribal leaders known as beys. These frontier lords commanded bands of mounted warriors called ghazis, men who combined religious zeal with the practical aim of securing plunder and land. Among these frontier chieftains was a man named Ertuğrul, leader of a small nomadic Turkish tribe that had fled westward from Central Asia ahead of the Mongol advance. For his loyal service to the Seljuk Sultan, Ertuğrul had been granted control of lands around the town of Söğüt, near Byzantine territory. Here, his people gradually transitioned from nomadic herders to settled farmers and frontier raiders. When Ertuğrul died around 1281, leadership of this modest domain passed to his son, Osman Bey. Osman was neither the richest nor the most powerful among the frontier lords, but he possessed qualities that would transform his small inheritance into the foundation of an empire. Charismatic and politically astute, he understood that success required more than mere military prowess. He built alliances through marriage, welcomed skilled refugees from Mongol-controlled territories, and incorporated Byzantine defectors into his growing state. Unlike some of his contemporaries, who conducted indiscriminate raids, Osman instituted a policy of relative tolerance toward Christian villagers who submitted to his rule. The early Ottoman state began to take shape through this pragmatic approach. Christians who submitted peacefully were protected and taxed, while those who resisted faced the full force of Osman's growing army. Local Greek, Armenian, and Turkish peasants often preferred Ottoman rule to that of the Byzantine landlords or other Turkish beyliks, finding Osman's taxation policies less burdensome. This pattern, military expansion combined with administrative incorporation of conquered peoples, would become a hallmark of Ottoman statecraft. Ottoman tradition recounts a dream that came to Osman early in his rise to power, a vision that has become central to the foundation myth of the empire. In this dream, he saw a great tree growing from his loins, its branches and leaves extending to cover much of the known world. Beneath its shade stood mountains, the Caucasus, the Atlas, the Taurus, and the Balkans. From the roots of this tree flowed 4 rivers, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile, and the Danube. Ships sailed on these waters, cities rose on their banks, and the crescent moon shone over all. When Osman related this dream to Sheikh Edebali, a revered Sufi mystic whose daughter he wished to marry, the holy man interpreted it as a divine promise of imperial destiny. Whether historical or apocryphal, this dream narrative served an important purpose. It provided divine sanction for Ottoman rule and positioned Osman's descendants as rightful heirs to a God-ordained mission. The dream would be invoked repeatedly throughout Ottoman history to legitimize the dynasty's claim to leadership of the Islamic world. Osman's early conquests were modest but strategic. He seized control of Byzantine castles and towns around Söğüt, gradually expanding his territory and attracting more warriors to his banner. By 1299, Osman felt confident enough to declare his independence from the failing Seljuk Sultanate, a date traditionally marking the birth of the Ottoman state. His followers began to call themselves Osmanlis, or Ottomans, those belonging to Osman. The nascent Ottoman realm was organized around military needs. Early Ottoman society maintained many aspects of its nomadic Turkic heritage, while adopting Byzantine and Seljuk administrative practices. The Ghazi warriors, who formed the backbone of Osman's armies, received land grants in newly conquered territories, creating a class of mounted soldiers who could be called upon in times of war. Markets grew around frontier fortresses, and a rudimentary bureaucracy began to take shape. religious institutions played a crucial role in consolidating Ottoman rule. Osman cultivated relationships with Sufi brotherhoods, whose mystical approach to Islam had wide appeal among both Turks and converts. Dervish lodges, established in newly conquered areas, served as centers for both spiritual and cultural assimilation, helping to integrate local populations into the Ottoman world. Islamic law provided the framework for governance, though it was applied with pragmatic flexibility in these early years. As Byzantine power continued to wane, Osman's forces pressed deeper into imperial territory. In 1301, his army defeated a Byzantine force at Baphius, establishing Ottoman control over most of Bithynia. This victory demonstrated that the Ottomans had evolved from mere raiders into a formidable military power capable of defeating imperial armies in pitched battle. Osman's son, Orhan, who had proven himself an able commander, led many of these later campaigns. Together, father and son methodically reduced the Byzantine strongholds in northwestern Anatolia, culminating in the prolonged siege of Bursa, a wealthy Byzantine city that commanded key trade routes. Though Osman directed the initial stages of this siege, he would not live to see its conclusion. In 1323 or 1324, as the siege of Bursa continued, Osman fell ill. Sensing that his end was near, he summoned Orhan and offered his final counsel. According to Ottoman chronicles, he advised his son to treat his subjects with justice, to expand the faith with the sword, and to favor men of learning. Then, with the simple dignity that characterized his life, the founder of what would become one of history's great dynasties died in his wooden residence at Soothe. Orhan completed the conquest of Bursa in 1326, making it the first capital of the Ottoman state. Legend holds that Orhan brought news of the city's fall to his father's tomb, fulfilling Osman's final wish. The modest beylik that Osman had carved out through courage, cunning, and charisma had been transformed into a principality of growing significance. In the green hills of Bursa, surrounded by sacred tombs and rising mosques, the Ottoman state had found its first true home. From Osman's dream-inspired beginnings, his descendants would build a power that would endure for 6 centuries. The sword of Osman, girded upon each new sultan in the dynasty's inauguration ceremony, would become the symbol of legitimate rule, passed down through generations of conquerors, builders, poets, and reformers. Though none could have foreseen it at the time, the foundation had been laid for an empire that would one day stretch across 3 continents and reshape the course of world history. As the green banner of the Ottomans fluttered over the minarets of Bursa, the dynasty that Osman had founded stood at a crossroads. The conquest of this prosperous Byzantine city marked both an ending and a beginning, the culmination of Osman's vision and the dawn of a new phase in Ottoman history. Under the leadership of his son, Orhan, the modest principality would evolve from a frontier beylik into a formidable state poised between 2 continents. Orhan Ghazi's 36-year reign, from 1326 to 1362, saw him inherit more than his father's territories. He inherited Osman's political acumen and talent for institution building. Establishing his court in Bursa, Orhan set about transforming the Ottoman realm from a loose confederation of Turkish warriors into an organized state. The conquest had brought wealth and prestige, but it also presented new challenges. The Ottomans now ruled over substantial non-Turkish, non-Muslim populations, requiring more sophisticated governance than frontier raiding had demanded. Orhan's first innovation was to commission the minting of the first Ottoman coins, a powerful symbol of sovereign authority. He established a rudimentary chancellery, adapting Persian and Byzantine administrative practices. In newly conquered Bursa, he converted churches to mosques but also built new religious complexes, including the magnificent Green Mosque that still stands today. These architectural projects announced the arrival of a dynasty with imperial ambitions. The Ottoman military system underwent crucial development during this period. While Ghazi cavalry remained important, Orhan recognized the need for infantry forces capable of conducting sieges and holding territory. Around 1330, he created the Yahya Corps, paid Turkish infantry soldiers who served as the first regular Ottoman military unit. More significantly, he laid the groundwork for what would become the Janissary Corps, an elite force of slave soldiers recruited from the empire's Christian subjects. This practice, formalized later as the Devshirme system, involved the periodic collection of Christian boys from rural areas. Converted to Islam and subjected to rigorous training, these youths became the Sultan's personal troops, owing loyalty to no one but him. What might seem cruel to modern sensibilities was, in context, often viewed as an opportunity. Many families willingly gave their sons to the system, knowing it offered a path to power and influence otherwise unattainable to Christian peasants. The Janissaries would evolve into one of history's most formidable fighting forces and the backbone of Ottoman military might for centuries. While consolidating his Anatolian holdings, Orhan kept a watchful eye on developments across the narrow seas. The Byzantine Empire, though weakened, still held Constantinople and territories in the Balkans. But Byzantine politics had become a snake pit of dynastic rivalries and civil wars. In 1346, Emperor John VI Cantacuzene, locked in struggle with the regency of John V Palaeologus, made a fateful decision. He sought Ottoman military assistance, offering Orhan the hand of his daughter Theodora in marriage. This Byzantine invitation provided the opportunity the Ottomans had been waiting for. In 1354, an earthquake damaged the walls of several Byzantine fortresses along the Dardanelles. Orhan's son, Suleiman Pasha, seized the moment, capturing the fortress of Tsimpe and then the important city of Gallipoli. Ottoman forces had established their first permanent foothold in Europe, a bridgehead from which they would launch the conquest of the Balkans. Suleiman did not live to build on this achievement, dying in a hunting accident shortly afterward. But the process he had begun continued under his brother Murad, who succeeded Orhan in 1362. During his 27-year tenure, from 1362 to 1389, Murad Afon transformed the Ottoman state from a regional power into an empire spanning 2 continents. Murad pursued a systematic strategy of expansion in both Europe and Anatolia. In Europe, Ottoman forces advanced steadily through Thrace, capturing the important city of Adrianople, which the Turks called Edirne in 1369. Impressed by its strategic location, Murad made Edirne his new capital, symbolically shifting the Ottoman center of gravity toward Europe. From this new base, Ottoman armies pushed into Bulgaria, Serbia, and Macedonia. The Ottoman advance alarmed the Christian states of the Balkans, who formed a coalition under the leadership of the Serbian Prince Lazar. On June 15, 1389, the 2 forces met at Kosovo Field, known locally as Kosovo Polje, in one of history's decisive battles. The details of this clash have been obscured by centuries of nationalist mythology, but we know that both Murad and Lazar perished. Murad was assassinated by a Serbian noble who had pretended to defect, and Lazar was executed after his capture. Though costly, Kosovo was an Ottoman victory that shattered organized resistance in the Balkans for decades. Murad's son Bayezid, who had commanded one wing of the Ottoman army, took charge on the battlefield, executing his brother to prevent any challenge to his succession, establishing a precedent of fratricide that would become Ottoman practice for preventing civil wars. For 13 tumultuous years, from 1389 to 1402, Bayezid I, nicknamed the Thunderbolt, Yildirim, for his lightning-quick military strikes, accelerated Ottoman expansion. In the Balkans, he reduced Serbia and Bulgaria to vassal states and pushed into Wallachia and Bosnia. When a crusading army, led by King Sigismund of Hungary and filled with French and German knights, marched to reclaim the Balkans for Christendom, Bayezid crushed them at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396. Most of the captured knights were executed, earning Bayezid a fearsome reputation in Western Europe. In Anatolia, Bayezid departed from the cautious approach of his predecessors, who had expanded gradually through alliances and targeted campaigns against Byzantine territories. Instead, he launched a systematic campaign to absorb the other Turkish beyliks, nearly doubling Ottoman territory. By 1390, the Ottomans controlled most of western and central Anatolia, bringing them into direct conflict with the rising power of Timur or Tamerlane in the east. Bayezid's rapid conquests were matched by significant internal development. He strengthened central authority, curtailing the power of frontier lords who had operated with relative autonomy. The Ottoman bureaucracy expanded, incorporating Persian administrative models. Islamic institutions were promoted, with new madrasas established across Ottoman territories. Bayezid also began developing a naval presence, recognizing that control of the seas would be essential for an empire straddling multiple coastlines. However, Bayezid's ambitions exceeded even his considerable military skills. While besieging Constantinople, a goal that had eluded his predecessors, he received word that Timur's vast army was advancing into Anatolia. The Central Asian conqueror, who claimed descent from Genghis Khan and had already carved out an empire stretching from India to the Mediterranean, had been provoked by Bayezid's aggression toward his Turkish vassals. The two empires collided at Ankara on July 20th, 1402. Despite commanding a formidable force, Bayezid found himself outmatched by Timur's superior numbers and tactics. When Turkish contingents in Bayezid's army defected to Timur, resentful of Ottoman centralization policies, the battle turned into a rout. Bayezid himself was captured and, according to legend, was kept in a cage at Timur's court until his death the following year. The Battle of Ankara nearly destroyed the Ottoman state. Timur reinstated the Turkish beyliks Bayezid had conquered, divided Ottoman Anatolia among Bayezid's sons, and established his own candidate as ruler in the European territories. After Timur's departure, the Ottoman realm descended into civil war, with Bayezid's sons fighting for supremacy. This period, known as the Interregnum or Fetret Devri, lasting from 1402 to 1413, threatened to undo a century of Ottoman state-building. Mehmed I, one of Bayezid's sons, eventually emerged victorious from this fratricidal struggle. With patience and political skill, he reasserted Ottoman control over both the Anatolian and European territories, though he was forced to accept the independence of some beyliks and the suzerainty of Timur's successor over parts of Anatolia. By his death in 1421, Mehmed had stabilized the Ottoman state and laid the groundwork for renewed expansion. His son, Murad II, inherited a recovered but still vulnerable empire. Throughout his 3 decades at the helm from 1421 to 1451, Murad fought to secure Ottoman borders, reassert authority over vassal states, and rebuild Ottoman institutions. In Europe, he faced determined resistance from Janos Hunyadi of Hungary and Skanderbeg of Albania, while in Anatolia, he gradually reabsorbed the independent beyliks. Though less celebrated than his predecessors or successors, Murad's patient consolidation was crucial for Ottoman recovery. The Byzantine Empire, meanwhile, had been reduced to little more than Constantinople and its immediate surroundings, surviving primarily because the Ottomans had been distracted by other challenges. In 1444, a Hungarian-led crusade threatened Ottoman control of the Balkans, but Murad decisively defeated this force at Varna, ending serious European attempts to roll back Ottoman conquests. In 1451, Murad died and was succeeded by his 19-year-old son, Mehmed II. The young sultan had already demonstrated both intelligence and ruthlessness during 2 brief periods when his father had temporarily abdicated. Now in full power, Mehmed turned his attention to the prize that had eluded his ancestors, Constantinople, which Turks called the Red Apple, that stood as both the symbolic heart of Eastern Christianity and the most strategically valuable city in the region. What Bayezid had attempted in haste, Mehmed would achieve through careful preparation. The stage was set for the conquest that would transform the Ottoman state into the Ottoman Empire and change the course of world history. The fall of Constantinople would mark both the definitive end of the Byzantine Empire and the beginning of a new Ottoman Golden Age. The century and a quarter from Osman's death to Mehmed, the second's accession, had witnessed the transformation of a small Turkish principality into a major international power. Through military skill, administrative innovation, and remarkable resilience in the face of catastrophic defeat, the Ottoman dynasty had established a state that balanced Islamic, Turkish, Byzantine, and Persian elements. As Mehmed II prepared for his date with destiny, the groundwork had been laid for an empire that would endure for centuries and shape the development of 3 continents. The city stood as it had for over a millennium, its massive walls rising defiantly above the waters where Europe and Asia almost touch. Constantinople, ancient Byzantium, had withstood countless sieges throughout its long history. Founded by Constantine the Great in 330 CE as the eastern capital of the Roman Empire, it had endured when Rome itself had fallen. Through wars, plagues, crusades, and civil strife, the Queen of Cities had survived, guarding the treasures of classical civilization within its libraries and churches. But now, in the spring of 1453, Constantinople faced its greatest challenge. The last emperor of Byzantium, Constantine XI Palaeologus, commanded a force of barely 7,000 defenders to hold walls that stretched for miles. His empire, once spanning 3 continents, had shrunk to little more than the city itself and a few scattered outposts. Outside those walls waited an army more numerous, more determined, and better equipped than any that had come before. Mehmed II had ascended to the Ottoman throne for the second time in 1451, following the death of his father, Murad II. Though only 19 years old, the young sultan had already tasted power during his father's brief retirement years earlier. Those who mistook his youth for weakness soon discovered their error. Mehmed possessed a fierce intelligence, an iron will, and ambitions that stretched far beyond the conquests of his ancestors. Upon taking the throne, Mehmed made his intentions clear. What my ancestors tried to achieve with many campaigns, he declared, I will accomplish with a single blow. Constantinople was his obsession, the prize that would transform the Ottoman state into a true empire. He studied the city's defenses, pored over accounts of previous failed sieges, and began methodical preparations for conquest. In 1452, Mehmed ordered the construction of a massive fortress called Rumeli-Hisare on the European side of the Bosphorus, directly across from the older Anatolian fortress of Anadolu-Hisare. Together, these strongholds created what Mehmed called the throat cutter, a gauntlet that could control all shipping through the strait. When a Venetian vessel defied the blockade, its crew was executed and its captain impaled, sending a clear message to those who might consider breaking the Ottoman stranglehold. Inside Constantinople, Emperor Constantine watched these developments with growing alarm. He sent desperate appeals for help to Western Europe, even agreeing to the union of the Orthodox and Catholic churches, a deeply unpopular move among his subjects, who remembered the Fourth Crusade's sack of their city in 1204. But the response was meager. Petty rivalries, religious differences, and the growing Ottoman power all discouraged intervention. In the end, only a few hundred professional soldiers arrived from Genoa and Venice, along with a brilliant Genoese engineer named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, who took charge of strengthening the city's defenses. The Ottoman preparations were impressive in their scale and innovation. Mehmed assembled an army of approximately 80,000 men, including elite Janissary infantry, Anatolian Turkish cavalry, and auxiliaries from his European vassals. To overcome Constantinople's legendary walls, he commissioned a Hungarian cannon founder named Urban to create siege artillery of unprecedented power. When the Byzantines had been unable to meet Urban's salary demands, the engineer had offered his services to Mehmed instead, a fateful decision. The result was a monster cannon that could fire stone balls weighing up to 1,500 pounds. So large it required 60 oxen to move it, and so powerful its blast could be heard for miles. This basilic cannon was accompanied by dozens of smaller but still formidable guns. Never before had such artillery been deployed against medieval fortifications designed for an earlier age of warfare. The Ottoman navy, meanwhile, sealed off the city from maritime relief. Although the Byzantines had stretched a great chain across the Golden Horn to prevent enemy ships from entering this natural harbour, Mehmed's fleet of over 120 vessels ensured that supplies could not reach the defenders by sea. On April 6, 1453, the Ottoman army took position before Constantinople's walls, and Mehmed sent his first and only offer to Constantine: surrender in exchange for the emperor's life and his people's safety. Constantine's reply was dignified but firm. He would not yield the city. The siege began the following day. For weeks, Ottoman cannons hammered the walls, particularly the vulnerable land walls of the Theodosian section. Byzantine engineers worked desperately each night to repair the damage, filling breaches with stones, wood, barrels, and even earth mixed with fabric. Several Ottoman attempts to storm these weakened sections were repulsed with heavy losses, as the defenders fought with the courage of desperation. Mehmed, facing unexpectedly stubborn resistance, knew he needed to break the harbour chain to complete his encirclement of the city. In one of history's most audacious military manoeuvres, he ordered his engineers to build a wooden track coated with animal fat. In a single night, dozens of Ottoman ships were hauled overland from the Bosphorus, across the peninsula of Galata, and lowered into the Golden Horn behind the protective chain. When dawn broke on April 22nd, the Byzantine defenders were horrified to see Ottoman ships in waters they had thought secure. Despite this setback, the defense continued. A daring night attack by the Byzantines to burn the Ottoman ships in the Golden Horn failed, resulting in the capture and execution of the brave sailors who had attempted it. Ottoman assaults on the walls were repeatedly repelled, though at a cost of irreplaceable defenders. Both sides recognized that time favored the attackers. The Byzantines were running short of men, food, and hope. By late May, the walls had been significantly weakened by constant bombardment. Mehmed called a council of war and announced his intention to launch a final, all-out assault. Before the attack, he addressed his troops, promising them the traditional 3 days of unrestricted plunder that Islamic military law permitted after a conquest. To further motivate his men, he arranged his forces to ensure competition among different units, promising special rewards to those who would be first to enter the city. Inside Constantinople, Constantine XI gathered his commanders for a final council. Knowing what the next day would bring, the last Byzantine emperor spoke movingly of the city's legacy and the duty they all shared to defend Christian civilization. Then he toured the walls, encouraging his exhausted men, before returning to the great church of Hagia Sophia for a final prayer service. Orthodox and Catholic clergy, setting aside their differences in this desperate hour, prayed together for deliverance. The final assault began in the early morning hours of May 29th, 1453. Wave after wave of Ottoman troops hurled themselves against the walls. The first attack by irregular troops was repulsed, as was a second assault by Anatolian soldiers. Then came the Janissaries, disciplined, fanatical, and determined. Near the gate of St. Romanus, where the walls had been most heavily damaged, they focused their attack. In the midst of this desperate fighting, Giovanni Giustiniani was severely wounded. As the Genoese commander was carried from the walls, confusion spread among the defenders. A small postern gate was left open for his evacuation, and some Ottoman troops discovered this undefended entrance. Almost simultaneously, a group of Janissaries managed to scale the walls near the Blashané Palace. As Ottoman flags appeared on the battlements, resistance collapsed in many sections. Emperor Constantine, seeing that the city was lost, reportedly cast off his imperial insignia and led a final charge against the invaders, preferring to die a soldier rather than be captured. His body was never officially identified, though Mehmed later provided a respectful burial for a corpse believed to be his. By midday, the Ottoman conquest was complete. Mehmed entered the fallen city on horseback, proceeding directly to Hagia Sophia. He stopped a soldier who was breaking up the marble floor, declaring, "Be satisfied with the booty and captives. The buildings of the city belong to me." The Sultan then ordered the great church converted into a mosque, symbolizing the Ottoman victory over Eastern Christianity. True to the customs of war, 3 days of looting followed. Priceless treasures were destroyed or carried off. Thousands of citizens were enslaved, and buildings were damaged. Yet Mehmed's ultimate vision was not destruction, but transformation. Once the sanctioned period of plunder ended, he set about rebuilding Constantinople as the new Ottoman capital. The Sultan took measures to repopulate his prize, inviting former residents to return and bringing in Muslims, Christians, and Jews from throughout his domains. He appointed a new Orthodox patriarch, Gennadius Scholarius, guaranteeing the church's survival under Ottoman rule. Tax incentives encouraged commerce, and ambitious construction projects began to transform the skyline with Ottoman architectural elements. The city gradually became known by its Turkish name, Istanbul, though both names would be used for centuries. The conquest of Constantinople sent shockwaves through Europe. Pope Nicholas V called for a crusade, but the response was tepid. Western powers were increasingly focused on their own rivalries and the emerging opportunities of Atlantic exploration. For the Islamic world, Mehmed's victory was a cause for celebration, a fulfillment of the Prophet Muhammad's hadith that Muslims would one day conquer Constantinople. For the Ottomans, the fall of Constantinople marked a watershed. No longer a frontier principality or even a regional power, The Ottoman state had transformed into an empire with a cosmopolitan capital straddling Europe and Asia. Mehmed himself adopted the title Caesar among his many honorifics, positioning himself as the legitimate successor to the Roman emperors. The young sultan, who had gambled everything on this conquest, would go on to earn his title, the Conqueror, many times over, adding territories in the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Black Sea region to his domains. But it was for Constantinople that history would most remember him, for ending the 1,000-year Byzantine Empire and beginning a new chapter in the story of the region. As the call to prayer sounded for the first time from the minarets of Hagia Sophia, the medieval world gave way to a new order. The Eastern Roman Empire was no more. In its place stood an Ottoman Empire, poised for its golden age, ready to shape the destinies of 3 continents for centuries to come. In the decades following the conquest of Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire entered an era that historians would later call its Golden Age. From the mid-15th century through the 16th century, a series of exceptional sultans expanded Ottoman territories, developed sophisticated institutions of governance, and fostered a flowering of culture and the arts. During this remarkable period, the empire reached the zenith of its power and prosperity, standing as one of the world's most formidable states. Mehmed II, flush with his triumph at Constantinople, continued his campaigns of conquest until his death in 1481. He subdued the remaining Byzantine outposts in the Black Sea region, conquered Serbia, and pushed deep into Greece and Albania. When the Venetians challenged Ottoman naval power, he built a fleet that wrested much of the Aegean from their control. In Anatolia, he finally eliminated the independent Turkish beyliks, creating a unified Turkish state for the first time since the Seljuk era. By the time of his death, Mehmed had more than doubled Ottoman territories. The conqueror's contributions extended beyond military expansion. He reorganized the Ottoman state along more centralized lines, curbing the power of frontier lords and old Turkish families. He created a sophisticated administrative system, drawing on Byzantine, Islamic, and Turkish traditions. His law code, the Kanuname, systematized Ottoman governance, establishing clear hierarchies and regulations that would guide the empire for generations. Mehmed also proved himself a patron of arts and learning. He rebuilt Constantinople as a magnificent capital, constructing the vast Topkapı Palace complex as the new center of Ottoman power. He established libraries, religious schools, hospitals, and other public institutions. The Sultan himself was a poet of some talent and spoke several languages. He invited Italian artists like Gentile Bellini to his court and supported Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars alike. After Mehmed's death, his son Bayezid II ascended to the throne, following a brief succession struggle with his brother Cem. Where his father had been a warrior sultan constantly on campaign, Bayezid was more contemplative, focusing on consolidation rather than expansion. Throughout his 3-decade tenure, from 1481 to 1512, Bayezid oversaw a period of relative peace and internal development. Bayezid strengthened Ottoman naval power, building a fleet that could challenge European maritime states across the Mediterranean. He extended welcome to thousands of Jews expelled from Spain after 1492, enriching Ottoman society with their skills in medicine, commerce, and craftsmanship. The Sultan himself was a mystic with Sufi leanings, patronizing religious foundations and scholarly works. As Bayezid aged, his sons began competing for the succession. His energetic son, Selim, governor of Trabzon, grew impatient with his father's cautious policies, particularly regarding the rising threat of Safavid Persia to the east. In 1512, supported by the Janissaries, Selim forced his father to abdicate in his favor and quickly eliminated his brothers and nephews to secure the throne. Selim Thürfsch, known as Yavuz or the Grim, transformed the empire through a series of whirlwind conquests during his brief but momentous 8-year reign from 1512 to 1520. His first target was Shah Ismail of Persia, founder of the Safavid dynasty. The Safavids promoted Shiite Islam and had gained significant support among Turkish tribes in eastern Anatolia, threatening Ottoman authority in the region. At the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, Selim's artillery and janissary firearms proved decisive against Safavid cavalry, securing eastern Anatolia for the Ottomans and establishing the rough border between Turkey and Iran that persists to this day. Selim then turned south, defeating the Mamluk Sultanate that had ruled Egypt, Syria, and the Hejaz for centuries. In 2 campaigns of breathtaking speed, Ottoman forces conquered Syria in 1516 and Egypt in 1517. With these victories came control of Islam's holiest cities, Mecca and Medina. The last Abbasid caliph, maintained as a figurehead by the Mamluks, transferred the symbols of the caliphate to Selim, adding religious authority to Ottoman power. While this transfer was of questionable legitimacy in Islamic law, it became an important element of Ottoman claims to leadership of the Sunni Muslim world. These conquests dramatically expanded Ottoman resources and strategic position. Egypt's agricultural wealth provided enormous tax revenues. Control of the Red Sea opened trade routes to the Indian Ocean. The empire now encompassed most of the central Islamic lands, with a vastly increased Arab population alongside its Turkish and Balkan subjects. When Selim died suddenly in 1520, he left his son Suleiman a greatly expanded empire with secure borders and abundant resources. Suleiman would make the most of this inheritance during a remarkably long tenure spanning nearly half a century. Under his leadership from 1520 to 1566, the Ottoman Empire would reach its apogee of power, territorial extent, and cultural achievement. The new Sultan was 25 years old, educated in the palace school, and had already gained administrative experience as a provincial governor. He quickly proved his military prowess by capturing Belgrade in 1521, removing a fortress that had resisted Ottoman attacks for generations. The following year, his forces took the island of Rhodes from the Knights Hospitaller after a massive 6-month siege, eliminating another long-standing Christian outpost in Ottoman waters. Suleiman then turned his attention to Hungary, the main Christian power in southeastern Europe. At the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, the Ottoman army annihilated Hungarian forces, killing King Louis II and most of Hungary's nobility. This catastrophic defeat left Hungary divided between Ottoman direct rule in the central regions, Habsburg claims in the west, and a semi-independent Transylvania in the east. The Ottoman Empire now extended deep into Central Europe. In 1529, Suleiman led an enormous expedition against Vienna, the Habsburg capital. Though ultimately unsuccessful due to early winter weather and extended supply lines, the siege of Vienna represented the high water mark of Ottoman advance into Europe. For the next century and a half, the Ottomans and Habsburgs would contest supremacy in southeastern Europe, with neither able to gain a decisive advantage. While the European frontier garners most historical attention, Suleiman also campaigned extensively in the east. He led 3 major expeditions against Safavid Persia, capturing Baghdad and securing Ottoman control over Mesopotamia. Naval campaigns in the Indian Ocean challenged Portuguese dominance there, while in the Mediterranean, the Ottoman fleet under the command of Hayreddin Barbarossa, whom Europeans called Barbarossa or Redbeard, established Ottoman naval supremacy. Barbarossa's career exemplifies the Ottoman maritime ascendancy during this period. Rising from humble origins as a corsair, he became Grand Admiral of the Ottoman Navy, defeating Christian fleets and securing North African territories for Ottoman suzerainty. From bases in Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, Ottoman naval forces dominated the central and eastern Mediterranean, threatening shipping lanes and raiding coastal settlements. Ottoman diplomacy also reached new levels of sophistication during Suleiman's reign. Breaking with Islamic tradition that had viewed Christian powers primarily as enemies, the Sultan established a strategic alliance with France against their common Habsburg rivals. Ottoman fleets wintered in French ports, and the two powers coordinated military actions. Commercial agreements called capitulations granted French merchants favorable trading status in Ottoman ports. Similar arrangements would later be extended to other European powers. Though these agreements, initially symbols of Ottoman strength and magnanimity, would eventually become tools of European economic penetration. The Sultan's military achievements earned him the title Kanuni, meaning the lawgiver among his Turkish subjects and the magnificent in European chronicles. Yet his reign was equally significant for its domestic developments. Suleiman commissioned his chief jurist to codify and reform Ottoman law, balancing secular regulations with Islamic Sharia. This comprehensive legal system provided a framework for governing the empire's diverse populations and would endure with modifications into the 19th century. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman administrative system reached its mature form. At its heart was the palace complex, where the Sultan ruled with the assistance of the Imperial Council or Divan. This governing body included the Grand Vizier, who acted as chief minister, other viziers responsible for different aspects of governance, military commanders, and chief financial and judicial officials. A sophisticated bureaucracy staffed by men trained in the palace schools implemented policies throughout the empire. The system maintained careful balances of power. Most high officials came through the Devshirme system, owing their position directly to the Sultan rather than to aristocratic birth. This slave elite prevented the emergence of a hereditary nobility that might challenge imperial authority. Meanwhile, religious scholars, or ulama, led by the Sheikh-ul-Islam, maintained significant autonomy in religious, educational, and judicial matters, providing a counterweight to purely executive power. Provincial administration followed a similar pattern of checks and balances. Governors, appointed by the capital, administered major provinces, but were balanced by locally appointed judges and military commanders who reported directly to Istanbul. The Timar system, granting cavalrymen land rights in exchange for military service, distributed imperial authority into the countryside, while providing a military force distinct from the Janissaries. Economically, the empire thrived on its control of major trade routes connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa. Ottoman territories encompassed ancient artisanal centers, producing textiles, ceramics, metalwork, and luxury goods. Imperial workshops in Istanbul produced goods of exceptional quality for the court. Guild organizations regulated urban production, maintaining standards and controlling competition. State price controls aimed to ensure urban populations could afford essential goods, preventing unrest in strategically important cities. Agriculture provided the economic foundation, generating tax revenues and feeding growing urban populations. Most farmers were free peasants rather than serfs, though they were bound to their lands for tax purposes. The empire maintained grain reserves to prevent famine and stabilize prices. Long-distance trade flourished, with merchants from diverse backgrounds, Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, creating commercial networks spanning the empire and beyond. This economic prosperity supported remarkable cultural and architectural achievements. No figure better represents Ottoman artistic heights than Mimar Sinan, Suleiman's chief architect. Born a Christian in Anatolia and recruited through the Devshirme, Sinan converted to Islam and rose through military engineering ranks before turning his genius to architecture. During a career spanning 50 years, he designed hundreds of structures, mosques, bridges, palaces, baths, and caravanserais throughout the empire. His masterpieces include the Shehzadeh Mosque, built to commemorate Suleiman's favorite son, the Suleymaniye complex, the Sultan's imperial mosque in Istanbul, and the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, completed when Sinan was in his 80s. These structures synthesized Byzantine spatial concepts, particularly the large central dome, with Islamic architectural traditions and Ottoman innovations. The resulting style was both distinctively Ottoman and universally impressive in its engineering sophistication and aesthetic harmony. Literature flourished equally under imperial patronage. Ottoman Turkish poetry reached its classical form, heavily influenced by Persian models, but developing its own distinctive voice. The court supported historians who documented the empire's achievements, scientists who advanced astronomical and mathematical knowledge, and religious scholars who produced sophisticated theological and legal works. Into this world of power and splendor came a figure who would profoundly influence Suleiman's later reign, Roxolana, or Hurrem Sultan. Captured in what is now Ukraine and enslaved in the imperial harem, this remarkable woman captivated the Sultan, became his legal wife, and wielded extraordinary influence. Breaking with tradition, Suleiman brought her to live with him in the main palace rather than the separate harem quarters. She bore him several children and maintained her position as his chief confidant until her death in 1558. Roxolana's rise transformed harem politics. Previously, sultans had maintained distance from their concubines once they had borne sons, preventing maternal influence over princely rivals. Roxolana changed this dynamic, remaining close to both Suleiman and her sons. She built charitable foundations, corresponded with foreign rulers, and influenced appointments and policy decisions. While some historians have portrayed her as manipulative, evidence suggests a genuine partnership with Suleiman and shared concern for imperial stability. The final decade of Suleiman's reign was marked by succession struggles among his sons. His eldest and most promising son, Mustafa, fell victim to court intrigues, possibly involving Roxolana's desire to advance her own son's interests. The Sultan ordered Mustafa's execution in 1553 during a campaign against Persia, a decision that shocked contemporaries and, some argue, marked the beginning of imperial decline. When Roxolana died in 1558, Suleiman was inconsolable. His remaining sons, Selim and Bayezid, soon turned against each other in open conflict. After Bayezid's defeat and execution, the less capable Selim remained as sole heir. By 1566, Suleiman was in his 70s, but still led his army on campaign, this time against Habsburg forces in Hungary. During the successful siege of Sigetvar, the aged Sultan died in his tent. Grand Vizier Sokolu, Mehmed Pasha, concealed the death until Selim could secure the throne, continuing the campaign as though the Sultan still lived and supervising an orderly transition of power. As Suleiman's body returned to Istanbul for burial in the magnificent tomb Sinan had designed for him, the Ottoman Empire stood at its zenith. Its territories stretched from Algeria to the Persian Gulf, from Crimea to Yemen. Its armies were the most formidable in the Mediterranean world, its bureaucracy the most sophisticated, its cities among the most splendid. The system that Suleiman had perfected seemed designed for permanence. Yet within this golden age lay seeds of future challenges. The practice of royal fratricide, taken to new extremes in the execution of Mustafa, would eventually be replaced by a system of princely confinement that produced sultans unprepared for rule. The Timar cavalry system was already losing military relevance compared to the Janissary infantry with firearms. Ottoman technological innovation was slowing relative to European developments, and the vast wealth flowing into the empire contributed to inflation and economic distortions that would eventually strain the administrative system. None of these problems was apparent as Selim II succeeded his father. The Ottoman Empire had reached heights few political entities in history have achieved, integrating diverse peoples and regions into a functioning imperial system that delivered security, prosperity, and cultural achievement to millions. The legacy of this golden age in architecture, art, literature, law, and governance would endure long after Ottoman power had waned, shaping the modern Middle East, North Africa, and Balkans in ways still visible today. The Ottoman Empire at its height governed a vast territory encompassing dozens of ethnic groups, religious communities, and traditional cultures. From the deserts of North Africa to the steppes of Crimea, from the mountains of the Balkans to the valleys of Mesopotamia, Ottoman rule bound together lands with profoundly different histories and populations. How did a single imperial system successfully manage such diversity for centuries? The answer lies in the distinctive governance structures, social arrangements, and cultural patterns that defined Ottoman civilization. At the heart of Ottoman governance was a principle of pragmatic flexibility. Rather than imposing uniform administration across their domains, the Ottomans adapted their rule to local conditions while maintaining core imperial institutions. This approach allowed them to incorporate new territories with minimal disruption while gradually extending central authority into the provinces. The Sultan stood at the apex of this system, embodying the state in his person and enjoying theoretically absolute power. Legitimacy flowed from multiple sources. The Sultan was guardian of Islam's holy places, heir to the Byzantine emperors, protector of trade routes, and head of the Ottoman dynasty, whose unbroken male line stretched back to Osman. In practice, the Sultan's authority was constrained by Islamic law, established customs, and the practical limits of pre-modern communication and transportation. Beneath the Sultan, the imperial government operated through specialized departments supervised by the Imperial Council or Divan. The Grand Vizier, as chief minister, coordinated governance and could represent the Sultan in most matters. Other viziers, the treasurers, the chancellors, and the military commanders comprised the highest ranks of administration. These officials met regularly to address matters of state, with the Sultan sometimes observing behind a screened window. Most high officials came through the Devshirmi system, the periodic levy of Christian boys from rural areas in the Balkans and Anatolia. Converted to Islam and educated in palace schools, these recruits formed an elite cadre, owing their position directly to the Sultan rather than to aristocratic birth or tribal connections. This slave elite system prevented the emergence of hereditary nobility that might challenge imperial authority, a problem that had plagued many other Islamic states. The military was similarly structured to balance power. The Janissary Corps, elite infantry recruited through Devshirmi, served as the empire's core professional army. Their skill with firearms made them formidable on the battlefield, while their presence in major cities protected imperial interests. Provincial cavalry, supported by land grants under the Timar system, provided a counterweight to Janissary power, while extending imperial authority into rural areas. Artillery units, naval forces, and auxiliary troops completed the military establishment, which at its height was the most effective fighting force in the Mediterranean world. Religious institutions constituted another pillar of imperial governance. The ulama, scholars trained in Islamic law and theology, formed a distinct hierarchy headed by the Sheikh ul-Islam, who could issue authoritative legal opinions even on the sultan's actions. Religious foundations, or vakufs, administered mosques, schools, hospitals, soup kitchens, and other public services. These institutions enjoyed considerable autonomy, providing essential social services while binding diverse regions to the imperial center through networks of religious scholarship and charity. Perhaps most distinctive was the Ottoman approach to managing religious diversity through the millet system. Rather than forcing uniformity, the empire recognized major religious communities as self-governing entities for many purposes. Each millet, organized under its religious leadership, handled matters of personal status like marriage, divorce, and inheritance according to its own religious law. The Greek Orthodox millet, headed by the Patriarch of Constantinople, was the largest non-Muslim community. Armenian Christians, various Eastern Christian denominations, and Jews each formed their own millets with similar autonomy. This arrangement reflected Islamic jurisprudence regarding people of the book, but the Ottomans developed it into a sophisticated administrative system. Non-Muslims paid a special tax called jizya in exchange for protection and exemption from military service. While clearly establishing Islamic supremacy, the millet system allowed significant religious freedom at a time when Europe was torn by sectarian violence. When Spain expelled its Jewish population in 1492, thousands found refuge in Ottoman lands, where Sultan Bayezid II reportedly remarked of the Spanish monarchs, "They say Ferdinand is a wise king, but he makes his lands poor and enriches mine by sending skilled Jewish refugees to Ottoman territories." The millet system exemplified a broader Ottoman approach to difference. While maintaining clear hierarchies, with Muslims above non-Muslims, Turkish above non-Turkish, and men above women, the empire created space for diversity to thrive. The Ottoman elite prided themselves on managing a complex, multicultural realm more effectively than their European rivals. A 16th century Ottoman official described the empire as a garden of many flowers, each contributing to the whole while maintaining its distinctiveness. Economically, the Ottoman Empire linked diverse production zones into an integrated imperial market while connecting to global trade networks. The empire controlled key commercial routes between Europe and Asia, particularly after the conquest of Egypt and Syria, secured the eastern Mediterranean and Red Sea. Ottoman territories encompassed major production centers for textiles, ceramics, metalwork, and agricultural goods. State intervention in the economy aimed primarily at ensuring urban food supplies, maintaining quality standards for exports, and preventing any single group from dominating essential trades. Guild organizations regulated urban production throughout the empire. These professional associations set standards, controlled entry to trades, provided social services for members, and served as intermediaries between craftsmen and the state. Guild membership crossed religious lines, with Muslims, Christians, and Jews working together in many trades. While allowing considerable autonomy, the guild system also enabled state supervision of urban economies and ensured tax collection. Agriculture remained the foundation of imperial prosperity, with most of the population engaged in farming. Peasant cultivators enjoyed protections under law and custom, and their tax obligations were generally predictable. Large-scale landholding was limited by imperial policy, which preferred small farms for both tax efficiency and military recruitment. State granaries helped stabilize food prices, preventing the worst effects of periodic shortages and maintaining urban calm. Trade networks spanned the empire, with merchants of various backgrounds creating commercial relationships across regional and religious boundaries. Greeks and Armenians dominated much of the internal trade, while Turkish, Arab, and Persian merchants maintained connections with more distant Muslim lands. Jewish communities often specialized in international commerce, maintaining ties with coreligionists in Europe and throughout the Mediterranean. By the 16th century, Ottoman cities had become major consumption centers for luxury goods from every corner of the known world. This economic integration supported a distinctive urban culture. Ottoman cities were organized around central complexes, combining mosques, markets, public baths, and educational institutions. Neighborhoods typically developed along religious lines, each clustering around its own places of worship, though commercial districts brought various communities together. Markets specialized in particular goods, from spices to textiles to metalwork, creating efficient commercial ecosystems. The Ottoman capital exemplified this urban culture at its most sophisticated. After the conquest of Constantinople, Mehmed II had rebuilt the depopulated Byzantine city as a magnificent Islamic capital, while preserving elements of its Christian heritage. Renamed Istanbul, though both names remained in use for centuries, the city was organized around great mosque complexes built by successive sultans. The skyline of domes and minarets created a visual counterpoint to the ancient churches that remained active for the Christian population. The Topkapı Palace, situated on the ancient Acropolis overlooking the confluence of the Bosphorus, the Golden Horn, and the Sea of Marmara, served as both the Sultan's residence and the administrative heart of the empire. Istanbul became one of the world's largest cities, with a population exceeding 500,000 by the late 16th century. This cosmopolitan metropolis drew people from throughout the empire and beyond. One could hear dozens of languages in its markets, from Italian to Persian, Greek to Arabic, Slavic tongues to Armenian. Each community contributed to the city's cultural life while adapting to its Ottoman context, creating a distinctive urban identity that transcended individual ethnic backgrounds. The material culture of Ottoman cities reflected this cosmopolitan sensibility. Architecture synthesized Byzantine spatial concepts with Islamic decorative traditions and Ottoman structural innovations. Textiles incorporated motifs from Persian, Chinese, Italian, and indigenous traditions. Ceramics from Iznik displayed Chinese-influenced designs executed with techniques developed in response to European porcelain. Ottoman cuisine blended Central Asian, Persian, Arab, and Balkan culinary traditions into something distinctively Ottoman, yet internally diverse. This cultural synthesis extended to intellectual life. The Ottoman court patronized scholars, poets, historians, and scientists from diverse backgrounds. Literary culture centered on Turkish, Arabic, and Persian traditions, with many educated Ottomans comfortable in all three languages. While Turkish served as the administrative language, Arabic remained the language of religion and law, and Persian the language of high culture and poetry. Ottoman Turkish poetry reached particular heights of refinement during the empire's golden age. Following Persian models, but developing distinctive forms and sensibilities, Ottoman poets created works of remarkable subtlety and technical sophistication. The poetry of figures like Baki and Fuzuli explored themes of love, both human and divine, power, beauty, and transience in language that played endlessly with double meanings and allusions. Sultan Suleiman himself, writing under the pen name Muhibi, was a poet of considerable talent. Historical writing flourished under imperial patronage, with court historians documenting Ottoman achievements for posterity. These works combined factual reporting with literary artistry and moral instruction, presenting Ottoman triumphs as evidence of divine favor while drawing lessons from setbacks. Scholars produced encyclopedic works cataloging knowledge in fields ranging from geography to botany, incorporating information from European sources alongside Islamic scholarly traditions. Religious scholarship maintained its vitality throughout this period. Sufi mystical orders, particularly the Mevlevi, known in the West as whirling dervishes, and Bektashi orders, developed distinctive practices and interpretations of Islamic spirituality. Orthodox Sunni scholars produced sophisticated legal opinions, addressing new situations confronting the empire. The interaction between mystical and legalistic approaches to Islam created a dynamic religious ecosystem that accommodated both popular piety and intellectual rigor. Science and medicine built upon earlier Islamic Golden Age achievements. Ottoman astronomical observatories made significant contributions, producing star catalogues and planetary tables of remarkable accuracy. Medical knowledge combined traditional Islamic medicine, derived from Greek sources, with empirical observations and techniques from various traditions. Ottoman surgeons developed specialized procedures for eye operations, fracture treatment, and other conditions, with illustrated medical texts displaying their advanced understanding of anatomy. The visual arts developed along distinctive lines shaped by Islamic prohibitions against figural representation in religious contexts. Calligraphy became the supreme art form, with masters developing styles of extraordinary grace and complexity for transcribing Quranic verses and poetic works. Geometric and floral designs achieved remarkable sophistication in architectural decoration, manuscript illumination, and textile patterns. While figural representation was avoided in religious contexts, Ottoman miniature painting flourished for historical manuscripts, scientific works, and literary texts, depicting court ceremonies, military campaigns, city views, and natural phenomena with meticulous detail. Music played a central role in Ottoman cultural life, from military bands to Sufi ceremonies, court entertainment to popular festivities. A sophisticated system of musical modes or makams developed, capable of expressing subtle emotional states and incorporating influences from Arab, Persian, Byzantine, and Turkish traditions. Distinctive instruments like the ney, tanbur, and kudum created the characteristic sound of Ottoman classical music, which was transmitted orally from master to student. Daily life for ordinary Ottomans varied enormously, depending on location, religion, occupation, and social status. For most, the rhythm of life followed agricultural seasons and religious calendars. Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities each observed their own holy days and life cycle rituals, though public spaces often brought different groups together. The public bath or hammam served as a social center, as did markets, coffee houses, and gardens. Coffee culture emerged as a distinctive Ottoman social institution during the 16th century. Introduced from Yemen, coffee quickly became the empire's favorite beverage, with specialized coffee houses appearing in major cities. These establishments functioned as information exchanges, literary salons, political forums, and entertainment venues. So significant was their role that authorities occasionally closed coffee houses during periods of unrest, fearing them as centers of dissent. Family life centered on the household, which often included extended family members and, in wealthy homes, servants or slaves. Marriage patterns varied by religion and region, but most households operated under patriarchal authority. Women's experiences ranged widely, depending on class and location. Elite women could exercise significant influence through family connections and economic activities, while peasant women worked alongside men in agricultural production. Though gender segregation was the norm in public spaces, women maintained active social networks within gender-appropriate contexts. Popular entertainment included shadow puppet theatres presenting satirical stories, public storytellers recounting epic tales, and sporting events like oil wrestling and archery competitions. Religious festivals brought communities together for processions, feasts, and celebrations. The sultans staged elaborate public ceremonies for circumcisions, weddings, and military victories, distributing food and gifts to cement popular loyalty. Education followed different paths for different social groups. Most children received basic religious instruction in neighborhood schools, attached to mosques, churches, or synagogues. Advanced education for Muslims centered on madrasas teaching Islamic law, theology, logic, and literature. The palace school provided specialized training for future administrators and military leaders. While formal education was largely male-dominated, informal knowledge transmission within households ensured that women acquired practical skills, cultural knowledge, and religious understanding appropriate to their expected roles. The Ottoman legal system balanced religious law with imperial legislation. Sharia courts administered by Qadis judges handled most civil and criminal matters for Muslims, while non-Muslims could bring cases to their own religious courts or to Ottoman courts as they preferred. The Sultan's authority to issue qanun, secular administrative law, allowed the empire to address situations not covered by religious jurisprudence. This dual system, religious and secular, provided both flexibility and legitimacy. By the mid-16th century, this complex social, political, and cultural system had reached its mature form. The Ottoman Empire had developed governance structures capable of managing extraordinary diversity while maintaining imperial cohesion. Its cultural achievements reflected both the synthesis of multiple traditions and original contributions across numerous fields. Though challenges would emerge in subsequent centuries, the foundations established during this period of Ottoman civilization would prove remarkably durable, shaping life throughout the Eastern Mediterranean world for generations to come. The strengths of this system were many. Its flexibility in incorporating diverse peoples, its balancing of central authority with local autonomy, its combination of religious legitimacy with practical governance, and its openness to cultural exchange and innovation within established frameworks. Yet these strengths contained potential weaknesses as well. The delicate balances between competing power centers could be disrupted by weak leadership. The compromise between religious ideals and pragmatic accommodations created tensions that could be exploited by purists, and the empire's vast scale made it inherently difficult to maintain uniform control as technologies and economic patterns evolved. As the 16th century drew to a close, the Ottoman Empire stood at its zenith, a sophisticated, cosmopolitan civilization spanning 3 continents. Its cultural and institutional achievements would leave an enduring legacy in regions from the Balkans to Arabia, North Africa to the Caucasus. Even as challenges emerged in subsequent centuries, the fundamental patterns of Ottoman governance and culture established during this golden age would continue to shape the lives of millions and influence the development of successor states into the modern era. When Suleiman the Magnificent died in 1566, the Ottoman Empire stood as perhaps the world's most powerful state. Its territories stretched across 3 continents, its armies had few peers, and its culture flourished. Yet even at this moment of imperial triumph, subtle shifts were occurring that would gradually transform the nature of Ottoman power. Over the next 2 centuries, the empire would face mounting challenges, both internal and external, leading to what historians have traditionally called the period of Ottoman decline. The seeds of these challenges appeared even before Suleiman's death. His son and successor, Selim II, lacked his father's commanding presence and military experience. Known as Selim the Sot due to his fondness for wine, he preferred pleasure to governance, delegating most affairs of state to his capable Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha. While Sokolu maintained the empire's strength, this pattern of sultanic disengagement would become increasingly common in subsequent generations. The Ottomans' succession system had always been fraught with danger. Earlier sultans had practiced fratricide, eliminating their brothers upon taking the throne to prevent civil war. Following Selim II's relatively peaceful accession, this brutal practice gave way to a new approach, confining princes to the palace rather than sending them to provincial governorships. While this reduced fratricidal violence, it created a new problem. Future sultans, raised in the sequestered luxury of the harem, rather than trained in administration and warfare, often proved ill-prepared for rule when their turn came. This change coincided with increasing influence of what Europeans called the Sultanate of Women, the political power exercised by imperial mothers, wives, and concubines. The valid sultan, or mother of the reigning sultan, often wielded enormous influence, particularly when her son was young or disinterested in governance. Figures like Kösem Sultan and Turhan Sultan effectively ruled the empire during periods of the 17th century, building alliances with Janissary leaders and high officials to maintain their authority. While some of these women proved capable rulers, their power struggles contributed to instability in imperial governance. Meanwhile, the Ottoman military system faced its own transformations. The Taimar cavalry, once the backbone of Ottoman expansion, became increasingly obsolete as firearms dominated the battlefield. The Janissary Corps, originally an elite force of slave soldiers completely loyal to the Sultan, evolved into a hereditary military caste with their own economic interests and political agenda. Recruitment increasingly came from free Muslim families, rather than through the Devshirme levy, changing the Corps' character and loyalties. Technological stagnation compounded these military challenges. Where the Ottomans had once led innovations in artillery and fortress design, they now fell behind European powers undergoing their own military revolution. Ottoman firearms production and tactics failed to keep pace with Western developments. The once formidable Ottoman navy, which had dominated the Mediterranean under Barbarossa, lost its technological edge and organizational efficiency. These military weaknesses became apparent in a series of costly wars. The long Turkish War with the Habsburgs between 1593 and 1606 ended in stalemate rather than Ottoman victory. A disastrous war with Persia resulted in territorial losses. Most symbolically, the naval battle of Lepanto in 1571, though strategically indecisive, had demonstrated that Ottoman fleets could be defeated by Christian powers, a psychological blow to Ottoman prestige. Economic challenges emerged alongside military setbacks. The price revolution of the 16th century, fueled partly by American silver flowing into global markets through European trade, caused severe inflation throughout Ottoman territories. Traditional price controls became increasingly difficult to maintain. The discovery of maritime routes around Africa diverted some Asian trade away from Ottoman-controlled overland routes. though this effect was more gradual than once thought. The Ottoman land regime also underwent problematic shifts. The Timar system, which had distributed land rights to cavalry soldiers, gave way to tax farming, where the right to collect taxes was auctioned to the highest bidder. While this initially increased revenue to the central treasury, it created perverse incentives. Tax farmers, seeking to maximize their profits during their limited terms, often exploited peasants beyond sustainable levels, damaging agricultural productivity and driving rural flight. Corruption became endemic in this environment. Positions within the imperial administration, once reserved for merit-based advancement through the devshirme system, were increasingly purchased rather than earned. The practice of taking gifts for appointments spread throughout the bureaucracy. Even the position of Grand Vizier sometimes went to the highest bidder rather than the most capable administrator. These internal challenges coincided with growing external threats. The Habsburg and Russian empires, Ottoman rivals to the west and north, grew stronger through military modernization and territorial expansion. Safavid Persia to the east remained a formidable opponent. European commercial penetration of Ottoman markets intensified, with merchants operating under the protection of capitulation agreements that increasingly favored foreign interests over domestic producers. Yet despite these mounting pressures, the Ottoman Empire demonstrated remarkable resilience. Periods of crisis alternated with episodes of revival and reform. Under the guidance of capable Grand Viziers from the Köprülü family in the latter half of the 17th century, imperial administration was temporarily restored to effectiveness. Ahmed Köprülü led Ottoman forces in the conquest of Crete, culminating a decades-long struggle with Venice for control of the Mediterranean island. The empire's territorial reach actually continued to expand in some regions even during this period of supposed decline. The Ottoman frontier pushed deeper into Ukraine and Poland-Lithuania, with vassal states like the Crimean Khanate extending imperial influence to the northern Black Sea shores. In 1683, Ottoman forces under Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha mounted a massive expedition against Vienna, nearly capturing the Habsburg capital before being repulsed by a coalition of European powers. This failed siege marked a turning point, however. The counteroffensive launched by the Holy League of Austria, Poland, Venice, and Russia inflicted a series of devastating defeats on Ottoman armies. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, ending the Great Turkish War, represented the first major territorial losses for the empire. Hungary and Transylvania passed to Habsburg control, while Venice gained territories in Greece, and Poland and Russia secured lands in Ukraine and the northern Black Sea region. These defeats shocked Ottoman elites into recognition that traditional methods were no longer sufficient. The early 18th century saw the first systematic attempts at military and administrative reform, inspired partly by European models. During the Tulip era under Sultan Ahmed III and his Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, the empire opened its first printing press publishing in Turkish, established new military training programs, and sent the first Ottoman ambassadors to European capitals to study Western techniques. These early reform efforts produced mixed results. Conservative reactions, particularly from religious scholars and Janissary corps members whose privileges were threatened, often reversed innovations. The Janissary rebellion of 1730, for instance, overthrew Ahmed III and ended the Tulip era reforms. This pattern of reform, attempts followed by conservative backlash, would characterize much of the 18th century, creating a halting, inconsistent modernization process. The geopolitical environment grew increasingly challenging. Russian power expanded dramatically under Catherine the Great, bringing direct pressure on Ottoman territories around the Black Sea. The disastrous Russo-Turkish War of 1768 to 1774 ended with the Treaty of Küçükkaynarca, which granted Russia access to the Black Sea, conceded territory in Crimea, and allowed Russian ships passage through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles. Most ominously, the treaty gave Russia the right to protect Orthodox Christians in Ottoman lands, providing a pretext for future interventions. Equally threatening was the rise of nationalist sentiment among the empire's subject peoples, particularly in the Balkans. Greek, Serbian, and Bulgarian cultural revivals, influenced by Enlightenment ideas filtering in from Europe, increasingly challenged Ottoman authority. The French Revolution further spread concepts of nationalism and popular sovereignty that undermined traditional imperial legitimacy based on dynastic and religious authority. Sultan Selim III, who reigned from 1789 to 1807, recognized these mounting threats and initiated the most ambitious reform program yet. His new order aimed to create a modern military force trained and equipped along European lines, overhaul the tax system, and reform provincial administration. While making some progress, Selim ultimately faced a conservative coalition of janissaries, religious scholars, and traditional elites who saw his reforms as threatening their privileges and Islamic traditions. In 1707, a janissary revolt deposed Selim and nearly ended the reform movement entirely. The most dramatic challenge to central Ottoman authority came from regional warlords who exploited imperial weakness to create semi-independent fiefdoms. In Egypt, an Albanian officer named Muhammad Ali Pasha seized power following the French occupation under Napoleon. Though nominally acknowledging the Sultan's authority, Muhammad Ali built a modern army and navy, developed Egypt's economy, and eventually threatened the Ottoman heartland itself. Similar powerful governors emerged in other provinces, from Ali Pasha of Janina in Greece to Ahmad al-Jazar in Palestine. By the early 19th century, the Ottoman Empire faced existential threats on multiple fronts. Military defeats continued to erode imperial territory and prestige. The Greek War of Independence, beginning in 1821, gained support from European powers sympathetic to the Greek cause and hostile to Ottoman authority. Russian forces repeatedly defeated Ottoman armies, advancing to within striking distance of Istanbul in 1829. Muhammad Ali's Egyptian forces occupied Syria and threatened Anatolia itself in the 1830s. European diplomats increasingly referred to the declining Ottoman state as the sick man of Europe, debating how its territories might be divided upon its seemingly imminent collapse. Yet despite these dire predictions, the empire would survive for another century through a combination of internal reforms, skillful diplomacy that played rival European powers against each other, and the remarkable tenacity of its remaining territories and populations. The period from the late 16th to the early 19th centuries thus represents not so much an absolute decline as a complex transformation of Ottoman power. While the empire lost its position of clear military superiority, it adapted to new geopolitical realities with remarkable flexibility. The Ottoman state evolved from an expanding militant empire to a defensive multi-ethnic polity focused on maintaining its territorial integrity against both external enemies and internal centrifugal forces. This transformation came at considerable cost. Military defeats resulted in territorial losses and massive population displacements as Muslims fled advancing Christian powers. Economic difficulties reduced living standards in many regions. Political instability undermined effective governance. Yet through these challenges, the fundamental Ottoman imperial system demonstrated surprising durability. The basic institutions of governance, the millet system of religious community autonomy, and the cultural patterns established during the Golden Age persisted, adapting to changing circumstances rather than collapsing entirely. The traditional narrative of Ottoman decline, with its implication of inevitable decay, fails to capture this complex reality. More accurate is a picture of an empire confronting the unprecedented challenges of a rapidly changing world. The military revolution in Europe, the transformation of global trade networks, the emergence of nationalist ideologies, and the Industrial Revolution that would soon reshape global power dynamics. That the Ottoman Empire survived these challenges at all, when many contemporary states did not, testifies to the resilience of the structures established during its formative periods. As the 19th century dawned, the Ottoman Empire stood at another crossroads. The old methods had clearly failed, but the path forward remained uncertain. The next phase of Ottoman history would be defined by ambitious attempts at systematic modernization and reform, efforts that would transform the empire in ways its founders could never have imagined. Whether these transformations would preserve the Ottoman state or accelerate its dissolution remained to be seen. As the 19th century dawned, the Ottoman Empire faced a stark reality. Its armies, once the terror of Europe, had suffered repeated defeats. Its territories were shrinking under pressure from European powers and nationalist movements. Its economy struggled against foreign competition and internal weaknesses, yet the empire refused to die. Instead, it embarked on the most ambitious period of reform in its history, attempting to transform itself from a traditional Islamic polity into a modern state capable of surviving in a rapidly changing world. This process began in earnest when Sultan Mahmud II ascended to the throne in 1808 amid crisis. The empire faced rebellions in Serbia and Greece, Muhammad Ali's growing autonomy in Egypt, and Russian expansion along the Black Sea. Domestically, powerful provincial notables called ayans had established virtual independence in many regions, while the Janissary corps remained hostile to necessary military reforms. Mahmud approached these challenges methodically, consolidating his authority before attempting dramatic changes. He first reached an accommodation with the ayans through the document of agreement, acknowledging their local power while reasserting their theoretical subordination to Istanbul. He then built a small corps of troops trained in modern European methods, carefully preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the Janissaries. That confrontation came in the summer of 1826, in the event known as the Auspicious Incident. When the Janissaries revolted against new military formations, Mahmud was ready. He rallied public support, secured backing from religious authorities, and used loyal artillery units to bombard the Janissary barracks. Thousands were killed, and the corps was officially abolished, removing the greatest obstacle to military modernization. With the Janissaries eliminated, Mahmud accelerated reforms across multiple fronts. He created a new army based on European models, with modern weapons, uniforms, and training methods. He reorganized the central bureaucracy, establishing specialized ministries in place of the traditional divan. He reformed tax collection, attempted to combat corruption, and strengthened direct control over the provinces. Even his appearance signaled change, as he adopted European-style clothing and trimmed his beard according to Western fashion. Mahmud's reforms laid crucial groundwork, but external events limited their immediate effectiveness. The Greek War of Independence, supported by European powers sympathetic to the Greek cause, resulted in the loss of southern Greece. Russia inflicted another devastating defeat in the War of 1828 to 1829, forcing territorial concessions and increased Russian influence. Most dangerous was the rebellion of Muhammad Ali Pasha of Egypt, whose modernized army, occupied Syria and threatened Anatolia itself, forcing Mahmud to seek Russian protection through the humiliating Treaty of Hunkar-İskelesi in 1833. Despite these setbacks, the reform impulse survived Mahmud's death in 1839. His son, Abdülmecid Aman, for one, continued and expanded his father's work through the famous Tanzimat reforms. The Tanzimat, meaning reorganization, began with the noble rescript of the Rose Chamber that same year and represented the most systematic attempt yet to modernize the Ottoman state and society. The Tanzimat reforms proclaimed equality before the law for all Ottoman subjects regardless of religion, guaranteed security of life and property, abolished tax farming, established regular military conscription, and created new secular courts alongside the traditional religious legal system. Though implementation was uneven, these measures represented a revolutionary reconceptualization of the relationship between the state and its citizens. Behind these reforms stood a remarkable group of Ottoman statesmen. Figures like Mustafa Reshid Pasha, Ali Pasha, and Fuad Pasha had served as diplomats in European capitals and understood both Western power and Ottoman needs. They recognized that the empire's survival required not just military modernization, but fundamental institutional reform. Their goal was not blind Westernization, but selective adaptation of European methods to strengthen the Ottoman state while preserving its essential character and independence. Education became a major focus of the Tanzimat reforms. New secular schools were established alongside traditional religious institutions, teaching modern sciences, foreign languages, and administrative skills. The School of Civil Administration trained bureaucrats, while the medical school and engineering school produced specialists needed for modernization. A new Western-style university, the Darul Funun, was eventually established. These educational reforms created a new class of Ottomans comfortable with both Islamic and European intellectual traditions. The legal system underwent similar transformation. New commercial and criminal codes, adapted from European models, were introduced alongside traditional Islamic law. Mixed courts handled cases involving foreign nationals. The judicial reforms culminated in the late Tanzimat era with the promulgation of the Makkel in 1876, a codification of Islamic civil law that harmonized traditional jurisprudence with modern legal principles. Communications infrastructure expanded dramatically. Telegraph lines connected distant provinces to the capital, allowing more direct central control. Railways began to link major Ottoman cities, though coverage remained limited compared to European networks. Steamship lines improved maritime connections. The first Ottoman newspaper was established, eventually followed by a vibrant press that, despite censorship, created a new public sphere for political and cultural discourse. The Tanzimat period also saw significant changes in Ottoman foreign relations. The Crimean War of the mid-1850s temporarily reversed the empire's fortunes, as Britain and France allied with the Ottomans against Russian expansion. The resulting Treaty of Paris formally recognized the Ottoman Empire as part of the European state system and guaranteed its territorial integrity. This diplomatic achievement was followed by the Reform Edict of 1856, which reaffirmed and expanded the equality of all Ottoman subjects regardless of religion. Yet these reforms also created new tensions within Ottoman society. Traditional religious scholars and conservatives viewed westernizing reforms with suspicion, seeing them as capitulation to Christian powers and abandonment of Islamic principles. Many Muslims resented the equality granted to non-Muslim minorities, who often benefited disproportionately from new economic opportunities through their connections to European merchants. Provincial populations sometimes experienced reforms primarily as increased taxation and conscription, rather than as improvements to their lives. Economic challenges further complicated reform efforts. The Ottoman Empire increasingly functioned as a source of raw materials and a market for manufactured goods within the expanding European-dominated global economy. Commercial treaties dating back to the 16th century had granted European merchants advantageous terms, preventing the Ottomans from protecting domestic industries through tariffs. The empire took on foreign debt to finance modernization projects and cover budget deficits, gradually losing financial independence. This financial dependency reached crisis proportions in the autumn of 1875, when the Ottoman government declared partial bankruptcy, unable to service its massive foreign debt. The European powers established the Ottoman Public Debt Administration 6 years later, giving foreign creditors direct control over significant portions of Ottoman revenues. While this arrangement stabilized Ottoman finances, it further limited the empire's economic sovereignty. The mid-19th century also saw the emergence of new intellectual currents among Ottoman elites. A group known as the Young Ottomans, including figures like Namık Kemal, Ibrahim Shinasi, and Ziya Pasha, advocated constitutional government and greater political freedoms, while seeking to reconcile Islamic principles with modern political concepts. Through newspapers, literature, and political activism, they popularized ideas of patriotism, liberty, and constitutional rule among educated Ottomans. These intellectual developments contributed to the brief triumph of constitutional government. Amid continuing crises in the Balkans and pressure from reformist elements, the new Sultan Abdülhamid II promulgated the first Ottoman constitution in December 1876, which established a parliament with representatives from throughout the empire. This experiment in constitutional monarchy proved short-lived, however. Using the Russian war as justification, Abdülhamid suspended the constitution after only 2 sessions of parliament and began a period of personal rule that would last 3 decades. The Russo-Turkish War delivered another devastating blow to Ottoman power. Russian forces advanced to the outskirts of Istanbul before being halted by diplomatic pressure from other European powers. The resulting Treaty of San Stefano imposed harsh terms, creating a large Bulgarian state under Russian influence and recognizing the independence of Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro. Though the subsequent Congress of Berlin, organized by the European powers, moderated some of these losses, the empire still surrendered significant territories in the Balkans, the Caucasus, and eastern Anatolia. These territorial losses triggered massive population movements. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims fled from Russian and newly independent Balkan territories to remaining Ottoman lands, creating a refugee crisis and fundamentally altering the demographic composition of the empire. The Ottoman state, now more concentrated in Anatolia and the Arab provinces, became more predominantly Muslim than ever before. For 33 years, from 1876 until his deposition in 1909, Sultan Abdülhamid II developed a distinctive approach to governance in response to these challenges. While continuing administrative modernization and economic development, he abandoned the liberal political aspects of the Tanzimat reforms. His reign combined centralization of power, modernization of infrastructure, Islamic religious emphasis, and repressive measures against dissent. Abdülhamid made effective use of modern technology to strengthen his control. He expanded telegraph networks to maintain direct communication with provincial officials. Photography was employed to document public works and project imperial power. The railway system grew substantially, improving both economic integration and military mobility. Educational reforms continued, producing a new generation of technically trained Ottoman officials, officers, and professionals. The Sultan emphasized his role as caliph, or religious leader of Sunni Muslims worldwide, more than his predecessors had done. This pan-Islamic policy served multiple purposes. It strengthened loyalty among Muslim subjects, positioned the empire as protector of Muslims beyond its borders, and countered European influence by appealing to religious solidarity. Abdulhamid cultivated relationships with Muslims in British India, Russian Central Asia, and Southeast Asia, creating concern among colonial powers about potential Muslim uprisings. Yet alongside these innovations came growing repression. Censorship tightened, political opposition was suppressed, and an extensive spy network monitored potential dissidents. Liberal intellectuals fled into exile, continuing their advocacy for constitutional government from Paris, Geneva, Cairo, and London. Ottoman embassies were tasked with tracking these dissidents, whose publications were smuggled back into the empire despite official bans. The most significant opposition movement to emerge during this period was the Committee of Union and Progress, commonly known as the Young Turks. Growing from student activism at the empire's medical and military academies, this movement initially brought together Turks, Arabs, Albanians, Circassians, and others, united by opposition to Abdulhamid's autocracy and commitment to constitutional governance. The Young Turks established cells throughout the empire and among exile communities, gradually building a network that extended into the officer corps. While political tensions mounted, demographic and economic transformations continued to reshape Ottoman society. Cities grew as rural migrants sought economic opportunities and refugees resettled from lost territories. Istanbul, Izmir, Beirut, and Salonika developed more modern infrastructure, with tramways, gas lighting, and Western-style buildings. An emerging middle class adopted European consumption patterns and cultural habits, while maintaining distinctively Ottoman identities. The empire's religious and ethnic composition changed significantly due to territorial losses, refugee flows, and varying birth rates among communities. Muslims became the clear majority, though significant Christian and Jewish populations remained, particularly in cities and certain regions. These demographic shifts influenced policy debates about the nature of Ottoman identity and the future direction of the state. Ottoman intellectual life vibrated with new ideas, despite censorship. Literature incorporated European forms while addressing Ottoman realities. Newspapers found ways to discuss social and political issues through careful phrasing and historical allegories. Scientific works introduced modern concepts while connecting them to Islamic intellectual traditions. Women writers, like Fatma Aliyeh, began publishing works addressing gender relations and social questions from an Islamic perspective. By the early 20th century, competing visions for the empire's future had crystallized among the educated elite. Ottomanism promoted a civic identity, embracing all citizens, regardless of religion or ethnicity. Islamism emphasized religious solidarity as the empire's core strength. Turkish nationalism, still in its early stages, began to foreground Turkish language and culture as the state's foundation. Western-oriented liberalism advocated European-style modernization, while socialism attracted support in industrial centers and ports. These ideological currents found expression in growing opposition to Abdulhamid's rule. During the summer of 1908, the long simmering tensions finally erupted into revolution when Ottoman army units in Macedonia, led by Young Turk officers, revolted against the central government. Facing the prospect of civil war, Abdulhamid reluctantly restored the 1876 constitution, and allowed elections for a new parliament. The Young Turk Revolution triggered momentary euphoria across the empire, with Muslims, Christians, and Jews celebrating together in public displays of Ottoman unity and constitutional patriotism. The restored constitutional era quickly revealed deep tensions, however. Counter-revolutionary forces attempted to reverse the changes in the following spring, briefly succeeding before being overcome by constitutionalist troops from Macedonia. Abdulhamid was deposed in favor of his brother Mehmed V, who became a constitutional monarch with limited powers. The Committee of Union and Progress gradually consolidated control over the government, evolving from a revolutionary organization into a political party with increasingly authoritarian tendencies. External crises further complicated this turbulent period. Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, which it had occupied since the Congress of Berlin. Italy invaded and annexed the Ottoman provinces of Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, modern Libya, in 1911 to 1912. Most devastatingly, the Balkan Wars swept away nearly all remaining Ottoman territories in Europe, including Salonika, Adrianople briefly, and Albania. Only a small foothold around Istanbul remained of the empire's once vast European domains. These defeats discredited the CUP government, but also strengthened the hand of its more nationalist elements. Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Kemal Pasha emerged as the dominant triumvirate, steering Ottoman policy in an increasingly Turkish nationalist direction. The liberal, multi-ethnic vision of the early Young Turk movement gave way to a more centralizing, Turkish-oriented approach, alienating Arab, Albanian, and other non-Turkish elites who had initially supported the constitutional revolution. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Ottoman Empire had undergone profound transformation. Its territory had contracted dramatically, with the loss of the Balkans, North Africa, and parts of the Caucasus. Its population had become more predominantly Muslim and increasingly concentrated in Anatolia and the Arab provinces. Its governance had modernized substantially, with centralized bureaucracy, improved communications, expanded education, and rationalized legal systems. Yet fundamental questions remained unresolved. Could the empire retain its remaining territories in the face of European imperialism and growing nationalist movements? Would its constitutional system evolve toward genuine democracy or revert to authoritarian rule? Could Ottoman identity survive as a unifying force, or would religious and ethnic divisions prevail? And most urgently, how would the empire position itself in the growing tensions among European powers that would soon erupt into world war? In the summer of 1914, as Europe moved toward catastrophe, the Ottoman Empire stood at a crossroads. Despite its designation as the sick man of Europe, it had survived a century of crises through adaptation and reform. But the greatest test still lay ahead, as Ottoman leaders made fateful decisions that would determine not just the empire's fate, but the shape of the modern Middle East. On a warm summer day in 1914, two ships appeared on the horizon off Istanbul. The German battlecruiser Goeben and light cruiser Breslau, pursued by British naval forces, sought refuge in Ottoman waters. Their arrival would alter the course of history, as Ottoman leaders made the fateful decision to allow these vessels into the Dardanelles in violation of neutrality rules. Renamed the Yavuz Sultan Selim and Midilli, and ostensibly purchased for the Ottoman navy, with their German crews now wearing fezzes as supposed Ottoman sailors. These warships symbolized the empire's drift toward the Central Powers in the opening days of World War I. This was not the Ottoman Empire's first choice. When European war erupted in August 1914, The initial Ottoman position was neutrality. The empire had emerged exhausted from the Balkan Wars just a year earlier, losing nearly all its remaining European territories and suffering a refugee crisis as Muslims fled advancing Balkan armies. The military, economy, and public morale all needed time to recover. Moreover, traditional Ottoman diplomatic strategy had been to balance rival European powers against each other rather than align firmly with any single bloc. Yet several factors pushed the empire toward Germany. The triumvirate dominating Ottoman politics, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Shamal Pasha, had grown deeply suspicious of Russian, British, and French intentions. Russia's historical ambition to control the Turkish Straits remained a constant threat. Britain had occupied Ottoman Egypt, and France had designs on Syria. Just before the war, Britain had requisitioned 2 warships being built for the Ottoman Navy in British shipyards, ships that had been paid for through public subscription and become a matter of national pride. Germany, by contrast, had cultivated Ottoman friendship through investment, military advisors, and railway construction, particularly the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. Kaiser Wilhelm II had twice visited Istanbul, presenting himself as a protector of Islam against other European powers. German diplomatic and military influence in Istanbul had grown steadily, with officers like General Lyman von Sanders overseeing the modernization of Ottoman armed forces. Most decisive was the personal conviction of Enver Pasha, the dynamic young minister of war who had emerged as the empire's most powerful figure. German-trained and an admirer of German military efficiency, Enver believed in Germany's ultimate victory and saw alliance with the Central Powers as the empire's best hope for survival and recovery of lost territories. On the 2nd day of August 1914, he signed a secret Ottoman-German alliance, though many in the cabinet remained unaware of its provisions. The final step toward war came in late October 1914, when Ottoman warships, including the former Goeben under German officers, bombarded Russian ports in the Black Sea. Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire on November 2nd, followed shortly by Britain and France. The Ottomans formally entered the conflict on November 14th, with the Sultan Caliph declaring jihad against the Entente powers, a call that produced limited response both within and beyond Ottoman territories. Thus began the most devastating war in Ottoman history, a conflict fought across multiple fronts that would ultimately bring about the empire's dissolution. From the snowy Caucasus Mountains to the searing deserts of Arabia, from the waters of the Dardanelles to the banks of the Suez Canal, Ottoman forces would face the combined might of the world's greatest empires. The conflict began disastrously for the Ottoman Empire. Enver Pasha personally led an ambitious winter offensive against Russian forces in the Caucasus, hoping to recapture territories lost in previous wars and perhaps spark an Islamic uprising in Central Asia. The campaign ended in catastrophe at the Battle of Sarikamish during the winter months spanning December 1914 and January 1915, where harsh weather and Russian resistance resulted in the loss of an entire Ottoman army. Of 90,000 soldiers who began the campaign, fewer than 15,000 returned, with thousands freezing to death in the mountain passes. This defeat had profound consequences. The collapse of Ottoman defenses in eastern Anatolia allowed Russian forces to advance, supported by some local Armenian groups who hoped Russian victory would bring Armenian independence. Ottoman authorities, already suspicious of Armenian nationalist aspirations, viewed this as treachery. The government ordered the deportation of the Armenian population from the war zone to Syria, claiming military necessity. What followed was one of the darkest episodes in late Ottoman history. The deportation quickly evolved into a campaign of massacres, forced marches, and exposure that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Armenians. Precise figures remain disputed amid continuing historical and political controversy, but the scale of the tragedy is undeniable. While the Ottoman government maintained these were unplanned consequences of wartime measures, evidence of centrally organized mass killings has led many historians and governments to classify these events as genocide. Some Turkish and Kurdish officials tried to protect local Armenians, while many ordinary Muslims sheltered their Armenian neighbors at great personal risk. But these humanitarian efforts could not prevent the broader catastrophe. While the Eastern Front descended into tragedy, another drama unfolded at the Dardanelles. British and French planners, seeking to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war and open a supply route to Russia, conceived an ambitious operation to force the Straits and capture Istanbul. The campaign began with a naval assault in March 1915, but Ottoman minefields and shore batteries repelled the Allied fleet. The Allies then launched an amphibious invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula in April 1915. What was intended as a swift operation turned into a bloody stalemate lasting 9 months. Ottoman defenders, led by a previously little-known officer named Mustafa Kemal, held their ground against forces from Britain, France, Australia, and New Zealand. The campaign ultimately failed, with Allied forces evacuating in the final weeks of 1915 and early January 1916, after suffering over 250,000 casualties. Ottoman losses were even higher, but they had achieved a significant defensive victory that boosted national morale and made Mustafa Kemal a military hero. Further south, Ottoman forces moved against the Suez Canal in February 1915, hoping to sever Britain's imperial lifeline. Though this attack was repulsed, it forced Britain to maintain substantial forces in Egypt, rather than deploying them to the Western Front. A second, larger offensive the following year also failed, after which British forces began advancing into Ottoman Palestine. In Mesopotamia, British forces advancing from Basra initially met with success, capturing Baghdad by March 1917. However, during the previous year, Ottoman forces had inflicted a major defeat on the British at Kut, where an entire British army surrendered after a 5-month siege. This victory, alongside Gallipoli, demonstrated that Ottoman forces remained capable of effective resistance despite the empire's overall weakness. Perhaps most consequential for the empire's future was the Arab Revolt, which began in the early summer of 1916. Sharif Hussein bin Ali of Mecca, motivated by both Arab nationalist aspirations and British promises of post-war independence, led an uprising against Ottoman rule in the Hejaz. Though the revolt's direct military impact was limited, its symbolic significance was enormous. Supported by British officers like Lawrence of Arabia and Arab nationalist intellectuals, the revolt presented an alternative vision of post-Ottoman political organization based on Arab identity rather than Islamic unity or Ottoman patriotism. The revolt reflected deeper tensions that had developed between the increasingly Turkish nationalist Young Turk regime and Arab elites. The CUP government's centralizing policies, Turkish linguistic nationalism, and wartime security measures had alienated many Arab leaders who had previously supported Ottoman constitutionalism. British and French encouragement of Arab aspirations, though ultimately disingenuous, found fertile ground in this growing disillusionment. At the same time, ominous developments in international diplomacy were shaping the empire's future without Ottoman input. The secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 between Britain and France outlined plans to divide Ottoman Arab territories into spheres of influence. The Balfour Declaration of November 1917 expressed British support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. These arrangements, made public by the Bolsheviks after the Russian Revolution, revealed Allied intentions that contradicted promises made to Arab leaders and deeply alarmed Ottoman officials. By the autumn of 1917, the cumulative effects of years of warfare had brought the Ottoman Empire to its knees. Military casualties approached 1 million men. Economic conditions had deteriorated dramatically, with requisitioning of food supplies causing widespread hunger. Disease spread through populations weakened by malnutrition. Inflation rendered currency nearly worthless. The government resorted to increasingly authoritarian measures to maintain control, further alienating the population. German influence over Ottoman affairs grew as the empire became ever more dependent on its ally for military and economic support. Despite these dire circumstances, Ottoman forces continued fighting effectively on multiple fronts. In Palestine, they repeatedly slowed British advances before finally being broken at the Battle of Megiddo in September 1918. In Mesopotamia, they conducted skillful defensive operations despite material inferiority. On the Caucasus front, the collapse of Russia following the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 actually allowed Ottoman forces to recapture territories lost earlier in the war and briefly advance into the Caucasus before British pressure forced a halt. The domestic situation continued to deteriorate, however. In October 1918, with Germany clearly headed for defeat on the Western Front and British forces advancing rapidly in Syria, the Ottoman government faced reality. Talat Pasha's cabinet resigned on October 14th, and the new government under Ahmedizet Pasha sought an armistice. On the last day of October 1918, Ottoman representatives signed the armistice of Mudros aboard a British warship, ending Ottoman participation in the war. The armistice terms were harsh but vague, allowing the Allies broad latitude for intervention. British, French, Italian, and Greek forces soon occupied various Ottoman territories, including parts of Anatolia. Istanbul itself came under Allied occupation, with foreign warships anchored in the Bosphorus and international troops patrolling the capital's streets. The Sultan and his government continued to function, but under foreign supervision and with severely limited authority. The post-war settlement imposed on the Ottoman Empire was embodied in the Treaty of Sèvres, signed on August 10, 1920. This document effectively dismantled what remained of the empire. The Arab provinces were separated as mandates under British and French control. Eastern Thrace and the area around Izmir were given to Greece. The Turkish Straits were internationalized. An independent Armenian state was to be created in eastern Anatolia, while the Kurds were promised autonomy that might lead to independence. International financial controls would govern what remained of Turkish finances. The rump Turkish state would consist of central Anatolia, effectively rendering it a European protectorate. But events had already begun to overtake this settlement. While the Sultan's government in occupied Istanbul reluctantly accepted Allied dictates, a resistance movement was forming in the Anatolian interior. Its leader was Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli, who had been sent by the Istanbul government to restore order in Anatolia, but instead began organizing nationalist resistance. Landing at Samsun on May 19, 1919, Mustafa Kemal quickly established contact with other nationalist officers and civilian leaders. He convened a series of congresses at Erzurum and Sivas that articulated a platform of territorial integrity and national independence. When the Istanbul government yielded to Allied pressure and dissolved the Ottoman parliament in early 1920, Kemal established a rival Grand National Assembly in Ankara on April 23, 1920, effectively creating a dual government situation. The Greek landing at Izmir in May 1919, sanctioned by the Allies and accompanied by violence against the Turkish population, galvanized nationalist sentiment. As Greek forces pushed inland, the Turkish national movement found its crucial rallying cause. The Sultan's government, compromised by its cooperation with the occupation, lost legitimacy among much of the population, while Mustafa Kemal's resistance gained support. What followed was the Turkish War of Independence, a complex conflict with multiple dimensions. Nationalist forces fought against Greek, Armenian, and French troops directly, while diplomatically maneuvering to divide the Allies and gain support from the Soviet Union. The Ankara government's military success against the Armenians in the east and the French in the south, combined with growing war weariness in Britain and France, gradually changed the diplomatic landscape. The decisive phase came in the Greco-Turkish War that lasted from May 1919 until September 1922. After initial Greek advances nearly reached Ankara, Turkish nationalist forces under Mustafa Kemal launched a massive counteroffensive in August 1922. Within weeks, they recaptured Izmir and drove Greek forces from Anatolia entirely, ending the immediate military threat to Turkish independence. A separate conflict loomed with Britain over the neutral zone of the Turkish Straits, but war was averted through diplomacy, culminating in the Armistice of Mudanya in October 1922. These nationalist victories rendered the Treaty of Sèvres effectively dead. To negotiate a new settlement, the Allies invited both the Istanbul and Ankara governments to a conference at Lausanne. Before this could begin, the Turkish Grand National Assembly took a momentous step on the first day of November 1922, formally abolishing the Ottoman Sultanate and separating the positions of Sultan and Caliph. Sultan Mehmed VI, the last Ottoman sovereign, left Istanbul aboard a British warship on November 17, 1922, bringing to an end a dynasty that had ruled for 623 years. The Treaty of Lausanne, signed on July 24, 1923, after months of hard negotiation, recognized the new Republic of Turkey as a fully independent state, within borders similar to those of modern Turkey. The Treaty of Sèvres was superseded. There would be no independent Armenia or Kurdistan, and Greek claims to Turkish territory were abandoned. In exchange, Turkey relinquished claims to former Ottoman lands in the Middle East and accepted a population exchange with Greece that would fundamentally alter the demographic makeup of both countries. With the Sultanate abolished and a new treaty secured, Mustafa Kemal and his allies moved to formalize the new order. On October 29, 1923, the Turkish Grand National Assembly proclaimed the Republic of Turkey, with Ankara as its capital and Mustafa Kemal as its first president. The Caliphate, temporarily retained as a purely religious office, would be abolished in March 1924, severing the last institutional link to the Ottoman past. Thus ended more than 6 centuries of Ottoman rule. An empire that had once dominated 3 continents, controlled the Eastern Mediterranean, and shaped world affairs for centuries, had contracted to a nation-state in Anatolia and a small European foothold. Yet from this catastrophic collapse emerged a new Turkish national identity and state structure that would prove remarkably resilient in the decades ahead. The Ottoman Empire had succumbed to a combination of external pressures and internal contradictions. European imperialism, rising nationalism among both Turkish and non-Turkish populations, economic underdevelopment despite reform efforts, and the catastrophic impact of the First World War all contributed to its dissolution. But the empire's legacy would endure, shaping the development of successor states throughout the Middle East, Balkans, and beyond in ways that continue to reverberate today. As the new Turkish flag rose over Ankara in 1923, the Ottoman Empire had formally ceased to exist. Its territories had been divided, its institutions dismantled, its last sultan exiled. Yet the legacy of 600 years of Ottoman rule could not be so easily erased. The empire had left an indelible imprint on the lands it had governed, shaping everything from borders to architecture, cuisine to music, religious practices to cultural identities. This Ottoman inheritance would profoundly influence the development of successor states throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and the Balkans, including the Turkish Republic that arose from its ashes. The most immediate heir to the Ottoman legacy was the Republic of Turkey under Mustafa Kemal, soon to be granted the surname Ataturk, meaning father of the Turks. Having led the national resistance movement to victory, Ataturk now embarked on a revolution in peacetime, transforming what had been the Ottoman heartland into a modern nation-state based on Turkish national identity and secular governance. Ataturk's reforms were breathtaking in their scope and speed. In 1924, he abolished the caliphate, ending the Ottoman claim to religious leadership of the Islamic world. Religious schools were closed, and education placed under state control. A new civil code based on the Swiss model replaced Ottoman laws, granting women equal rights in matters of divorce and inheritance. Traditional headgear was discouraged, with the fez, once a symbol of Ottoman modernity, now banned as a relic of the past. Most dramatically, in 1928, the Arabic script used for writing Turkish for centuries was replaced with a modified Latin alphabet, severing a key cultural link to the Ottoman era. These changes aimed to create a distinctly Turkish national identity, separate from the Ottoman Islamic imperial legacy. State-sponsored historians promoted a narrative that emphasized pre-Islamic Turkish history and downplayed the Ottoman period. The Ottoman past was often portrayed as an era of backward religious governance that had prevented Turkish national development. Official histories celebrated the Turkish War of Independence as a complete break with the imperial past rather than as its transformation. Yet beneath this revolutionary rhetoric, important continuities persisted. Many institutions of the Turkish Republic evolved directly from late Ottoman predecessors. The army, bureaucracy, and educational system maintained significant Ottoman organizational features, despite ideological reorientation. The parliamentary system drew on the constitutional experiments of the late empire. Even Ataturk's reforms, revolutionary as they were, continued the top-down modernization approach, pioneered by Ottoman reformers from Selim III to the Young Turks. Most fundamentally, the human capital of the new republic came directly from Ottoman society. Ataturk himself and most of his associates were products of Ottoman military and professional schools, shaped by late Ottoman intellectual currents. The nascent Turkish middle class that supported republican reforms had developed during the final Ottoman decades. Ordinary citizens throughout Anatolia carried Ottoman cultural patterns into the Republican era, regardless of official ideology. The ambivalent relationship with the Ottoman past would characterize Turkish politics throughout the 20th century and beyond. During the early Republican period and subsequent decades of strict Kemalist orthodoxy, official discourse minimized positive references to the Ottoman era. By the 1980s, however, economic liberalization and political openings allowed more nuanced reassessments of Ottoman history to emerge. Conservative and Islamist movements increasingly invoked aspects of the Ottoman heritage as alternatives to Western-oriented Kemalism. This Ottoman revival accelerated under the Justice and Development Party government that came to power in 2002. Prime Minister and later President Recep Tayyip Erdogan often employed Ottoman symbols and references, positioning modern Turkey as the natural heir to Ottoman grandeur. Government-sponsored historical dramas romanticized Ottoman conquests and power. Celebrations marked Ottoman anniversaries that earlier Republican governments had ignored. Neo-Ottoman architectural motifs appeared in public buildings, and Ottoman Turkish courses were added to some school curricula. Critics viewed this Ottoman revival as a challenge to Ataturk's secular republic, while supporters saw it as a healthy reconnection with historical roots and cultural authenticity. Both perspectives contained elements of truth. The Ottoman past offered a rich reservoir of symbols and traditions that could be selectively deployed to support various contemporary political projects, from religious conservatism to geopolitical assertiveness. Beyond Turkey's borders, other successor states developed their own complex relationships with the Ottoman legacy. In the Balkans, where Ottoman rule had lasted for centuries, national narratives often portrayed the Ottoman period as an era of foreign occupation and oppression that had interrupted these nations' natural development. Yet Ottoman influence remained visible in everything, from food to music, architecture to vocabulary. Balkan Muslims, particularly in Bosnia, Albania, and North Macedonia, maintained more positive associations with the Ottoman era as a time when their communities had flourished. In the Arab world, the Ottoman legacy underwent significant reassessment over time. Early Arab nationalist movements had defined themselves partly in opposition to Ottoman rule, portrayed as Turkish domination that had suppressed Arab cultural development. The arbitrary borders drawn by European powers after World War I, dividing the formerly Ottoman Arab provinces into separate states, created new national identities that often denied Ottoman-era connections. By the late 20th century, however, some Arab intellectuals began re-evaluating the Ottoman period more positively, recognizing it as an era of relative regional integration and Islamic governance before European colonialism. This reassessment accelerated after the 2011 Arab Spring uprisings, which prompted questions about national identities and alternative political models. Ottoman administrative divisions sometimes re-emerged in discussions of more natural regional groupings than those imposed by the post-World War I settlement. In physical terms, the Ottoman legacy remains highly visible throughout its former territories. Architectural masterpieces from imperial mosques in Istanbul to frontier fortresses in the Balkans, from desert caravanserais to urban market complexes, testify to Ottoman power and artistic achievement. Urban layouts in cities from Sarajevo to Damascus, Thessaloniki to Baghdad still reflect Ottoman planning principles. Restoration efforts have increased in recent decades, with Ottoman monuments recognized as valuable cultural heritage regardless of contemporary political boundaries. The culinary legacy of the empire proved particularly durable, transcending political divisions. Ottoman imperial cuisine, developed in palace kitchens that drew ingredients and techniques from throughout the empire, lives on in Turkish, Greek, Balkan, and Arab cooking traditions. Dishes like dolma, stuffed vegetables, burek, savory pastries, baklava, layered sweet pastry, and köfte, spiced meatballs, appear with regional variations throughout former Ottoman lands. Coffee culture, introduced to Europe through Ottoman territories, remains central to social life across the region. Linguistic influences similarly crossed political boundaries. Turkish loanwords persist in the languages of the Balkans, Arabic, and Greek, particularly in domains like administration, urban life, and cuisine. Conversely, the modern Turkish language, despite Ataturk's language reforms that removed many Arabic and Persian elements, still bears the imprint of its Ottoman development within a multicultural empire. Religious developments in post-Ottoman territories reflected both continuities and ruptures with imperial patterns. The millet system's legacy of religious community autonomy influenced arrangements in many successor states, though often in attenuated form. Religious institutions established during the Ottoman period, from grand mosques to neighborhood techies, Sufi lodges, continued to serve their communities, adapting to new political contexts. In the Balkans, distinctive Islamic practices shaped by centuries of Ottoman rule persisted among Muslim populations, creating distinctive regional expressions of the faith. In geopolitical terms, many contemporary tensions in the former Ottoman regions have roots in imperial administrative divisions, population movements, and the subsequent European-imposed boundaries. Issues ranging from Arab-Israeli conflicts to Kurdish nationalist aspirations, from Cyprus to Balkan ethnic tensions, can be traced partly to Ottoman-era developments and their disruptive transformation during and after World War I. The arbitrary borders drawn by European powers often disregarded Ottoman administrative units that had evolved to reflect natural geographic and demographic patterns. The Ottoman imperial model itself continues to influence political imagination in the region. For some Islamist movements, the Ottoman Caliphate represents a historical example of Islamic governance encompassing diverse populations. Pan-Arab nationalists, conversely, sometimes portray the post-Ottoman fragmentation of Arab territories as an artificial division requiring reunification. In the Balkans, memories of Ottoman rule inform debates about European integration and regional identity. In Turkey, neo-Ottoman foreign policy orientations periodically emerge, seeking to rebuild influence in former imperial territories. Academic understanding of the Ottoman Empire has evolved significantly since its fall. Early Western scholarship often emphasized decline narratives and Oriental stereotypes, while nationalist historians in successor states minimized positive aspects of Ottoman governance. By the late 20th century, however, more nuanced approaches emerged, recognizing the empire's sophisticated administrative systems, pragmatic management of diversity, and significant cultural achievements. Access to Ottoman archives, improved translation of Ottoman Turkish sources, and interdisciplinary approaches have transformed scholarly understanding of Ottoman history. Popular culture has both reflected and shaped public perceptions of the Ottoman past. Historical novels, films, and television series set in the Ottoman era have proliferated, particularly in Turkey, but also internationally. Productions like the Turkish series Magnificent Century, depicting the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, achieved massive viewership across former Ottoman regions, despite historical inaccuracies and contemporary political controversies. These cultural products often reveal more about current concerns than historical realities, but they have stimulated public interest in Ottoman history. Tourism has likewise contributed to new engagements with the Ottoman legacy. Sites from Topkapı Palace in Istanbul to the starry Most Old Bridge in Mostar have become major attractions, with restoration projects often emphasizing their Ottoman heritage. Culinary tourism celebrating Ottoman-influenced regional cuisines has grown significantly. These developments have both commercialized and revitalized connections to the imperial past. The contemporary relevance of Ottoman history extends beyond the empire's former territories. The Ottoman experience of managing religious and ethnic diversity within a single political system offers potential insights for multicultural societies worldwide. Ottoman diplomatic balancing among competing powers resonates in current discussions of multipolar international relations. The empire's ability to adapt and evolve over 6 centuries, despite periodic crises, demonstrates institutional resilience worth studying in an age of rapid global change. As the modern Republic of Turkey approaches its centenary, its relationship with the Ottoman past continues to evolve. Rather than a simple rejection or embrace of imperial heritage, contemporary Turkish society exhibits a complex engagement with Ottoman history, selectively drawing on its symbols, achievements, and traditions, while adapting them to modern national identity. Political leaders invoke Ottoman grandeur, while historians document the complexities of imperial governance. Restoration projects highlight Ottoman architectural masterpieces, while debates continue about the empire's treatment of minority populations. This ambivalent relationship echoes across former Ottoman lands, where imperial legacies remain visible in everyday practices, even as official narratives sometimes minimize their significance. From the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula, communities continue to negotiate their connections to a shared imperial past that transcended the national boundaries that now separate them. Despite a century of nation-building projects that often defined themselves against Ottoman cosmopolitanism, traces of imperial patterns persist in unexpected ways. The Ottoman Empire ultimately represents more than just a historical polity that rose, flourished, and fell. It embodies a distinctive approach to governance, culture, and identity that developed at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Its strengths and weaknesses, achievements and failures, continue to influence regional developments and offer potential lessons for our own time. Though the empire itself has passed into history, its legacy lives on in the lands and peoples shaped by 6 centuries of Ottoman rule, an indelible part of the mosaic that constitutes the modern Middle East and Balkans. As we reflect on this legacy today, perhaps the most important insight is the Ottoman Empire's remarkable adaptability. From its origins as a frontier principality, to its height as a global power, to its final transformations, the Ottoman state continuously evolved in response to changing circumstances. For over 6 centuries, it incorporated diverse influences, managed complex diversity, and reimagined its institutions while maintaining core continuities. This capacity for change within tradition allowed it to endure far longer than most imperial systems. The story of the Ottoman Empire is not simply one of rise and fall, of conquest and defeat. It is a complex narrative of cultural synthesis, institutional innovation, pragmatic governance, and human experience across generations and geographies. Its legacy cannot be reduced to simple judgments or contained within national boundaries. It lives on in the languages people speak, the food they eat, the buildings they inhabit, the faiths they practice, and the identities they construct. In Istanbul, once Constantinople, and before that Byzantium, the physical embodiment of this legacy stands in monuments like the Hagia Sophia, which has served as Byzantine cathedral, Ottoman mosque, secular museum, and again as mosque. Each transformation adding layers of meaning rather than erasing what came before. This palimpsest quality characterizes the Ottoman legacy throughout its former domains, where imperial patterns remain visible beneath the structures of nation-states and modern politics. A century after the empire's dissolution, we can now view Ottoman history with greater perspective than was possible for those who lived through its traumatic final years. Neither romanticizing it as a lost golden age, nor dismissing it as an era of oppression and backwardness does justice to its complexity. The Ottoman Empire was a human institution, with all the achievements and failures that implies. Its story deserves to be understood in its full dimensions, not merely as a prelude to the nation-states that succeeded it, but as a significant chapter in world history with continuing relevance for our present and future, from a frontier tribe to a world power and back into memory. The story of the Ottoman Empire traces an arc that seems almost mythic in its scope and symmetry. A small band of Turkish horsemen, led by a chieftain's dream, transformed into one of history's most enduring political entities, before finally dissolving amid the ruins of the First World War. 6 centuries of history, spanning 3 continents and countless human lives. What remains when an empire fades? The borders drawn in its absence still shape our world, creating nations where once stood provinces. The wounds of its final years still ache in collective memories, informing conflicts and grievances that simmer generations later. The descendants of its subjects, scattered across dozens of modern states, carry fragments of its legacy in their languages, cuisines, and customs. In Istanbul, the empire's final capital, Ottoman ghosts linger in every vista. Minarets and domes punctuate the skyline, the architectural signature of imperial ambition and faith. In the Grand Bazaar, merchants still hawk their wares in spaces first built by Mehmed the Conqueror. Along the Bosphorus, wooden Yala mansions from the 18th and 19th centuries still catch the same sea breezes that once cooled Ottoman pashas and poets. But the Ottoman legacy extends far beyond Turkey's borders. In Sarajevo, Ottoman-era bridges still span the Miljacka River, silent witnesses to centuries of history, including the assassination that triggered World War I. In Jerusalem, the walls built by Suleiman the Magnificent still define the old city, embracing holy sites of 3 faiths. In Cairo, Ottoman-era mosques and mansions stand amid the bustling metropolis. In Athens, Thessaloniki, and countless Balkan towns, Ottoman architectural elements persist, despite centuries of nationalism that often sought to erase them. The cuisine of the former Ottoman realms represents perhaps its most accessible legacy. From Turkish kebabs to Greek moussaka, from Bosnian burek to Lebanese kibbeh, the flavors developed in imperial kitchens continue to define regional foods, transcending political boundaries drawn in the empire's wake. The ritual of coffee, spread throughout the region during Ottoman times, remains a cornerstone of social life across former imperial lands. More subtly, but perhaps more significantly, Ottoman approaches to governance left lasting imprints on successor states. Centralized bureaucracy, the balance of religious and secular authority, approaches to managing diversity, and relationships between urban centers and rural hinterlands all show traces of Ottoman patterns, even when official narratives deny this continuity. The millet system's accommodation of religious difference provided an early model for pluralism that, despite its hierarchical nature, influenced later approaches to multicultural governance. The Ottoman Empire's long interaction with Europe shaped both sides of this relationship. The empire served variously as Europe's enemy, trading partner, exotic other, and object of intervention. European identity partly defined itself against the Ottoman threat, while also selectively adopting Ottoman cultural elements from coffee to tulips. Conversely, Ottoman modernization drew heavily on European models while adapting them to imperial contexts. This complex mutual influence continues to shape debates about Turkey's place in Europe and broader questions of civilizational boundaries. For historians, the Ottoman Empire offers a fascinating case study in imperial longevity and adaptation. How did a state maintain legitimacy and effectiveness across such vast territories and diverse populations for so many centuries? How did it balance tradition and innovation, religious authority and practical governance, central control and local autonomy? Why did reform efforts ultimately fail to prevent imperial collapse? These questions continue to stimulate scholarly inquiry and offer potential insights for understanding other complex political systems. For ordinary people living in former Ottoman lands, the imperial legacy operates at different levels of consciousness. Sometimes it emerges in explicit heritage tourism or nationalist rhetoric, other times in unconscious cultural patterns or family histories. Genetic studies reveal the complex population mixing that occurred under Ottoman rule, belying later nationalist myths of ethnic purity. Archaeological and architectural research continues to uncover physical evidence of Ottoman presence, even in places where it was later downplayed or denied. The fall of the Ottoman Empire coincided with the birth of the modern Middle East, with all its contemporary challenges. The borders drawn by European powers to divide Ottoman territories, often with little regard for geographic, economic, or demographic realities, created states that continue to struggle with questions of legitimacy and identity. The imperial collapse left power vacuums that various movements have sought to fill, from Arab nationalism to political Islam, each claiming to offer a more authentic alternative to Western-imposed systems. Perhaps most poignantly, the Ottoman Empire represents a lost world of pre-national diversity and coexistence, however imperfect. Before the homogenizing forces of nationalism transformed the region, Ottoman cities contained mosaics of languages, religions, and cultures interacting in daily life. Markets where Turkish, Arabic, Greek, Armenian, Ladino, and countless other tongues mingled. Neighborhoods where mosques, churches, and synagogues stood in close proximity. Governance systems that, while maintaining clear hierarchies, recognized group identities rather than imposing uniform citizenship. This cosmopolitan reality, despite its inequalities and tensions, offers a counterpoint to later nationalist simplifications. As the muezzin's call to prayer echoes across ancient skylines, as artisans practice crafts passed down through generations, as families gather around tables laden with dishes whose origins trace back to imperial kitchens, the Ottoman past remains present. Neither fully embraced nor entirely rejected, it remains a complex inheritance with which successor societies continue to grapple, a ghost that cannot be exorcised because it is woven into the very fabric of regional identity. The empire now sleeps in history, its sultans and subjects, conquests and defeats, glories and tragedies transformed into museum exhibits and scholarly debates. Yet in countless visible and invisible ways, Ottoman patterns persist, shaping the contours of contemporary life across a vast region. The borders of its former territories may now be filled with nation-states flying different flags, but beneath these modern constructs, the deep currents of Ottoman influence continue to flow. And so our journey through Ottoman history comes to a close, not with a definitive judgment, but with an invitation to deeper understanding. The empire was neither the romantic Oriental fantasy portrayed in some Western accounts, nor the unmitigated darkness depicted in some nationalist narratives, nor the perfect Islamic state sometimes imagined in religious revisionism. It was a human institution with all the complexity, contradiction, achievement, and failure that implies. Its story deserves to be told neither with nostalgic longing nor with simplistic condemnation, but with the nuance and respect that 6 centuries of human experience demand. As the sun sets over the Bosphorus, where Europe and Asia nearly touch, where Constantine built his new Rome and Mehmed established his Islamic capital, where the waters carry whispers of history from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, perhaps we can glimpse something of both the grandeur and the humanity of this remarkable empire that rose, flourished, and fell, leaving an indelible mark on the world we inhabit today.